All hail His Majesty. Are there any constituency statements from honourable members? I call the member for... Member for Ryan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Bureau of Meteorology has just declared a La Niña event is underway, the third in a row. In Ryan, we are particularly vulnerable. We've had 3 cataclysmic floods in my lifetime. They won't stop, and with climate change, they're becoming more frequent. Our 60 kilometres of river frontage and 300 kilometres of creek and waterway frontages in Ryan puts us at very high risk. And as around 50% of our total area of 366 square metres is bushland and conservation areas, bushfire is also a future risk in El Niño situations. So it's perfectly reasonable to ask, as La Niña 3 bears down on us, what action is coming out of this knowledge? Natural Hazards Research Australia Chief Executive Andrew Gissing says, and I quote, "It's a really good idea to sit down with your family members or your employees and figure out what you're going to do." Okay, is it entirely up to our frightened, exhausted community? It can't be. So where's the government plan? Where's the funding? Currently, 97% of disaster spending happens in response and recovery, while only 3% preparing for disasters. And I believe this has to change. The National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, has recently formed through a merger of existing agencies and is now the primary agency responsible for most Australian government disaster preparedness and response. The head of NEMA, former New South Wales Fire Chief Greg Mullins, who's now with Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, says we need change. A shift from responding to disasters to actually preparing for them, and I agree. But my community in Ryan is sceptical that the full scale of what we need to be prepared for the disasters to come has actually been understood. The money is there for a full disaster preparedness plan. It's about priorities. The Labor government is about to spend over $100 billion on nuclear submarines from the US. The government's new Disaster Ready Fund, on the other hand, only $200 million a year. And what we need right now is an action plan, I believe, coordinated, detailed, well-funded and localised. An action plan to deal with the immediate, like escape infrastructure, rescue capacity, emergency support, housing, food, etc. The medium term, like compensation, buying back homes, rebuilding and integrated planning, no more development in floodplains, and the long term, like mitigation and climate action now, so no new coal and gas. In the absence of this, we in the Ryan Electorate Office are already rallying volunteers. Thank you.
I call the member for Whitlam.
Thanks, Speaker. The 2022 UCI World Championships have concluded in my hometown of Wollongong. More than 1,000 of the top international cyclists from over 90 countries took part in the course. Our Aussie team made the country and the region incredibly proud, and I'd like to extend my congratulations to the men and the women's elite and time trial teams. We scooped up a few medals, including a bronze in the team trial, mixed division, a bronze for the Aussie rider Michael Matthews in the main event, the men's elite race, and 2 silvers for Grace Brown, an elite women's individual time trial. Amish McKenzie in the junior men's individual time trial as well. I'd also like to congratulate Illawarra local Josie Talbot for her efforts, who in a spectacular turn of events was able to ride past her home along the course in Wollongong in her UCI debut. You made the entire region proud. Wollongong put on a show with the race broadcast globally to millions of viewers, and event organisers estimate that over 200,000 attendees across 9 days enjoying the city. The Wollongong 2022 community ride saw over 2,600 participants jump on their bikes, and over 1,300 volunteers dedicate their time to show the world how amazing and beautiful the region really is. The event is going to have a long-term ongoing impact for the region's tourism industry, with a direct injection of money into the local economy, as well as having the Wollongong City awarded the UCI Bike City status prior to the event as a show of the commitment that the international body has for the effort that the region made. This makes Wollongong the only city in the Southern Hemisphere to have received the status with the official label received by the city and my good friend, the Deputy Lord Mayor Tanya Brown, at the opening ceremony. By holding the UCI in Wollongong, this has had a direct flow-on effect for the region. No telling of the story could pass without making remark of Dutch cyclist, female cyclist Annemiek van Vleuten, who won the female elite event from the Netherlands with a broken elbow, making an amazing final dash in the last kilometre to pass the peloton and take the goal. Also, Remco Evenepoel from Belgium, who had a fantastic team from that country with a spectacular finish as well. An avid cyclist myself, it was a privilege. I couldn't spend as much time as I would have liked to at the event. I spent most of my time watching it on telly, but it was a great event and the city did the region and the country proud.
I call the member for Fadden.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise on behalf of the citizens of the Northern Gold Coast seat of Fadden to express our deep condolences of the loss to the world of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The world has lost a true servant, but heaven has gained a true saint. Many of my constituents who've come in to sign the condolence book, many in person and many more online, have found themselves expressing a sense of loss, a sense of sorrow, a sense of grievance. Many of them not even quite understanding why. Why do they feel such a sense of loss for a monarch so far away, yet a monarch who managed to become so close to the Australian people? A monarch who visited so many times, a monarch who stood the test of time, decency, of stature, of service. A monarch who had outlived the reign of some 14, 15 prime ministers in her country and indeed in ours. It is an extraordinary story of Elizabeth Windsor, the late Queen Elizabeth II. And one of the reasons the citizens of the Gold Coast find themselves sorrowful and reflective is because the monarch has stood as a testimony of stability and service for 70 years. It is a life that has put service before self, a life that saw others before her own needs, a life that saw her give up whatever hopes and dreams she may have had for her life to put them second to the call of duty and service for national life. This is a monarch that saw the dismantling of colonisation, that saw the opening up of countries, that saw many countries stepping forward in terms of republicanism or self-determination, or a lessening of the stature of the Queen and the office in our country, the lessening of the stature of the Privy Council, the raising of our own national anthem, and the moving forward in our own sense of self-determination. And she did that with the grace and the status of a true world leader. It's estimated some half the world may have watched her funeral. Now, the Brits always do pomp and ceremony well. They're renowned for it. But this time they did it because it was deserved. And in this case, richly so. Few funerals have garnered such attention. The last one I could think perhaps may have been Mother Teresa or Nelson Mandela. For truly, Queen Elizabeth II, through her acts of service, works or walks in such company, stands with such grace, and has such legacy. Indeed, God save the King, for we have lost the Queen.
I call the member for Burt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to pay tribute today to some beloved members of our community who we have lost recently. I begin with my friend and Burt community leader, Mr Salim Youssef. Salim, or Sam, as many of us knew him, was a powerhouse in our community, who we recently lost too soon on the 31st of August. Salim came to Australia in 1991, fleeing war in Lebanon, settling in Perth in 1998. Salim's legacy will be the Australian Arab Association. He recognised the importance of diverse voices and points of view being heard, and Salim and his wife Amal's vision was that of a truly multicultural society, and I think our community will be forever proud of what they have achieved, because the Australian Arab Association of WA is a non-profit, non-political, non-religious organisation that aims to help all newcomers to Australia, and especially those of Arab origin, and to provide a friendly place to socialise and to reach services and opportunities. The AAA has always been about outreach and bringing communities together, especially through their annual Eid and multicultural festivals, which have grown every year and provide an amazing opportunity for the sharing of cultures. More recently, Sam and his brother Rafe started a Lebanese sweets and catering business, following in the footsteps of their father in Lebanon. It is the only such business in Western Australia. Sam's support for our community is also reflected in his extensive community work, including with Rotary in the area of healthcare, as a local Justice of the Peace and as a key member of the WA Government Multicultural Advisory Council. Sam's work has been recognised by state, local and national awards, including as a People of Australia Ambassador in 2012 and 2014. Sam was a dedicated member of the Australian Labor Party as well, serving as president of the Gosnells Thornley branch and Burt, working with the state MPs and always supporting me and our state MPs such as Chris Talentire, Terry Healy and Tony Buddy in our campaigns and in the community. Salim will be deeply missed by so many of us. You were such a great friend. I offer our sincere condolences to Amal, his children Natasha and Aisha, and the extended Youssef family, colleagues and friends. Balay Salim Youssef. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to express my condolences to the family of Mike Devereaux, a former Deputy Mayor of the City of Gosnells, a Labor stalwart as well, someone I met and shared office with in the then Canning Electorate Council and taught me so much about the importance of grassroots politics. And finally, to remember a titan of our community, the Gosnells RSL President, Stuart Holmes, to thank him for his service.
A division has been called for in the House. Proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. And I call the member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I was unable to be present last Friday for the special sitting of Parliament to debate the condolence motion, the passing of Queen Elizabeth, and I thought I might take a few minutes here this afternoon to make some remarks. The level of emotion raised by the passing of Queen Elizabeth II has surprised many, not just here in Australia, but across the Commonwealth and to countries beyond, as people have paused to reflect on a life and contribution in this fast-moving world in which we live. Through changes of governments, major conflicts, natural disasters and huge economic challenges, the Queen has remained concerned, informed, compassionate and committed, and that in itself is remarkable. That she was able to keep that level of incredible commitment to a constituency right across the Commonwealth is unlikely to ever be equalled. That she was able to keep that intensity up for 7 decades across 2 centuries is quite remarkable. Most of us alive today, and that's anyone under about the age of 75, and I notice you raise your eyebrow, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm certainly not one of them, cannot remember a world without Queen Elizabeth. She visited Australia on 16 occasions. She came to South Australia 7 times. However, she was renowned for taking interest outside the capital cities, and on a number of occasions in South Australia found time to visit the regions, including visits to Woomera, to Port Lincoln and to Whyalla twice, all in my electorate of Grey. Many will have personal memories of those occasions. In fact, she was the only reigning monarch to have ever visited Australia, and considering how much the world and particularly international travel has changed in that time, that may not be as remarkable as it seems at face value, but nevertheless, It is a fact and should be noted. It is a status I suspect may change fairly soon, as I would expect that King Charles, who has visited Australia many times in the past, will become the second ruling monarch to visit us. Queen Elizabeth II was loved and respected by the global community, and our affection for her continued to grow as her reign progressed. She reigned across 7 decades, and her tours to Australia forged a bond which has survived throughout that time. I wish her family all the best as they deal with their personal grief, and extend good wishes to King Charles III. And I'd also like to thank my many constituents who have found their way to my electorate offices to sign condolence motions. I apologise to the people to Whyalla who had 2 visits from the Queen, that my office was actually shut owing to long-term commitment around leave and an employee being replaced, but the condolence book is in place now and they can now sign it.
I call the member for Tanging.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm new to this role as a Member of Parliament, so many people come to my office every day about the issue that matter to them most. So with even more coming through via emails, I'm going to read out a few emails here. This emails was received on the 24th of August, 12:06 p.m. Dear Mr. Lim, congratulations on your appointment to office this previous May. I was very pleased. Mr. Lim, I'm having an issue trying to obtain a passport for my daughter, and I don't know where else to turn to. We applied for a passport for my daughter in April this year. We are traveling on September 6, which is only 7 business days away. We will be devastated if the passport does not arrive in time, and we have to cancel. I think this would also be a massive failure in the system. Please, can you intervene for us and call DFACS on our behalf and urge them to process the application? And we reply straight away. And on the same day, 1:46, she replied, "Thank you so much for your fast, prompt reply. If there is anything within your power that you can do to help my daughter's passport issue in time for her travel, I'll be so grateful." And a few more correspondence was done from our office to her. So on the 26th of August, she wrote a letter to us saying that, "I went to the passport office today and they couldn't really help. Please don't bother trying to help my daughter. I don't think it is going to make any difference." But we keep doing what we're doing, and on the 29th of August, she sent us a very happy email. My daughter's passport is ready for collection. Thank you so very much." So for the last 3 months, we have been dealing with ocean of passport and visa inquiries. This has been the top 2 issue for my electorate office. I'm very proud my staff have helped to solve many cases and have many happy constituents work out for my office with a big smile on their face. Passport is something every Australian should have access to without causing them so much stress and headache. I'm glad our government is putting action to rectify this issue. Special thanks to the Minister Jill for his hard work. And I'm very satisfied to see myself as a new member of this Parliament is contributing and providing support and reassurance to our community. Thank you.
Call the member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a great opportunity today for me to provide a bit of an update to members of the Deakin electorate on a range of projects that the former coalition government funded in our area that are coming to fruition, and indeed projects that are going to continue to improve our area and make sure that we invest in the infrastructure that we need. Firstly, to many members in the Whitehorse area, you will have seen that work is progressing very quickly on the Heatherdale Reserve Pavilion. We provided $2 million of funding to kick off this project, and thankfully Whitehorse City Council have got involved to assist with the Heatherdale Cricket Club and Heathmont Jets Junior Football Club home ground. Completion of the project we expect by the end of this year, in time for at least part of the cricket season, but it is an outstanding facility. Work's also recently begun, again partnering with Whitehorse City Council, on the SportLink redevelopment, which will see a number of outdoor netball courts covered. This was a project that I, again, was proud to kickstart with a $1.5 million grant to the Whitehorse Netball Association. Not only will we see upgraded courts and a roof, but LED lights, improved drainage, just to make sure that all of the players can get on the court far more often and not be subject to inclement weather. Again, completion of the project will be this summer. We've also pleased to see that work will commence soon on the Vermont South Club, which will be an important project to increase the capacity of the club. In Maroondah, we've got a number of projects that are really coming towards their finalisation, the first being the upgraded pavilion for Cheong Park for the South Croydon Cricket and Football clubs, a project that was delayed by COVID, but getting there. The Ainsley Park Cricket Club and East Ringwood Junior Football Club will soon see the Ainsley Park Pavilion upgrade completed. Again, I was pleased to kick this project off with a $500,000 grant that's now being supported by Maroondah City Council. A number of local road projects as well, Mr Deputy Speaker, are coming to fruition. Firstly, the Wanturna Road, Riley Street notorious intersection. Work is basically done. We're just waiting now for Vic Roads to signalise and get things going in the new lights, but this is going to provide enhanced safety for our community. Also, the Tortoise Drive, Warrandyte Road intersection, which we've committed $4.8 million towards. That project, again, with Vic Roads, planning has basically completed and design has been completed, and we're just waiting on Vic Roads to get started. But again, investments from the former coalition government into our area which will make our community better.
I call the member for Brand.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker. Well, it's been a big month of sport in my electorate of Brand, particularly for the Rockingham Rams Football and Netball Club. Last weekend, I watched the Rams take on the Pinjarra Tigers at the Women's Peel Football League Grand Final at Rushton Park. It was great to see some of the young women playing. We're in the first girls team that I sponsored when I was first elected back in 2016. This is the jumper that they get to wear, and they love it and I love it. It's been awesome to see how some of the young women like Kalani Ingram, Aisha Ugle-Woods, Amber Henn, Gabby Kalika, Ella Bailey and Dakota Del Bello have developed their skills and commitment to the game and their team over the last 6 seasons. They've come a long way, and it's really been great fun and a great honour to witness. The game was hard fought by both sides, with the Tigers eventually clawing their way to a 4-point win. To the team themselves, I congratulate you all on reaching the big game. I know losing a grand final hurts. Goodness knows I've lost a few of them playing hockey, but you should be so proud of your efforts on the day and over the course of the season. I know it will not be your final grand final. I also want to congratulate other parts of the club, the men's Colts for making their grand final, and of course the reserves team, who are the 2022 premiers after defeating South Mandurah 52-54 in a clearly very close game. Now, on the netball side of the club, in August, the Rams took home 3 premierships in the Peel Netball League, with the Reserves, League 3 and the Under-23 team all winning their grand finals. Congratulations to all the teams, all the players, all the volunteers, all the parents, all the coaches, everyone that helps. Results like this for the footy and netball club only come about with the dedication and hard work from all the players, the supporters and the coaching teams. The Rockingham Rams should be extremely proud of the community culture they have developed over the years. It's clubs like the Rams that cultivate champions like Aaron Norton at the Western Bulldogs and Courtney Hodder, who currently plays for the Brisbane Lions. Courtney is a premiership player, winner of the 2021 Goal of the Year, and was nominated for the 2021 Rising Star Award. And she achieved all of this in her debut season. And she also designed the Brisbane Lions Indigenous round jersey. I want to congratulate the Rockingham Rams on a stellar year for their results in football and netball. I'm looking forward to attending the club's 75th anniversary on the 1st of October and celebrating with you all. And I also want to have a shout out and congratulate Michael Holland, the president of the Rockingham Rams Football and Netball Club, who first got me involved after I was elected in 2016. He's been a committed president of the club. He's done a great deal for the community that is the club. I understand he might not be continuing as president because he wants to give someone
else ago. But to you, Michael, congratulations and thanks so much for being so welcoming to me.
I call the Deputy Leader.
I rise to acknowledge the sudden passing of Angus McNeil, AM, from Rand in southern New South Wales. Many members and senators from my side of politics will know Angus as a true Liberal Party stalwart, serving on the New South Wales Liberal Rural and Regional Committee and as FEC President in the seat of Farrer for well over 20 years. Alongside his strong commitment to family, Angus dedicated much of his acting working life to the wider Rand community's social and environmental well-being and benefit, using a gentle, spirited passion and enthusiasm. This service to community started young when, in his early 20s, he attended a local football club meeting where no one had put their hand up for the vacant role of president. With everyone turning around looking blankly, in the end Angus said, "I'll do it." In his words, "I didn't have a clue how to run a meeting or anything like it, but that's really where it all started." Over the next 50 years, he would play pivotal and voluntary roles through New South Wales Farmers, Grain Producers Australia, Landcare and the Murray Catchment Management Authority. He became a local councillor with the Uranus Shire and chaired or organised numerous committees and groups to benefit Rand and citizens through the Southern Riverina. He did all this while running his own family farm in a very progressive, forward-looking way, and always, like many farmers, keen to share his knowledge and his experience. When the railway lines were removed from the town of Rand and trees were planted, he went out during hot summers and watered them to make sure they survived. I doubt anyone else would have. When everyone was painting their silos, he was determined that the Rand silo be part of this so that people could find this unusual and rather special town in the Riverina. Just two simple examples of his community spirit. On his first meeting with you, he would lope towards you with a long outstretched hand and a cheerful grin, a bit like a character popping out of a Ken Maynard Ettamogah pub cartoon. He has been the one constant in my political life, calling me on the phone out of nowhere and suggesting that I become the candidate for Farrer in a contest where the Liberal Party was never expected to win. In politics, his profound belief was that the Liberal Party is best placed to help people wanting to give life their best shot, whether you live in the city, the country or beyond. His motto in life was a simple one: you can achieve a great deal if you don't care who claims the credit. Angus was honoured with an Order of Australia Medal in 2019. He passed away suddenly, aged 80, on Sunday night, leaving behind his beloved wife Gail, daughters Georgie, Kate and their families. On behalf of myself, our local community and the Liberal Party, I extend our heartfelt sympathy, best wishes and warm thanks to all he was able to achieve. Angus Allan John McNeil. Rest in peace.
I call the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. And I'd particularly like to extend my thanks to our emergency services personnel, our health services, both in Ballarat and across metropolitan Melbourne, and the Loretto School community for their incredible efforts in rescuing and supporting the 27 students, the teachers and driver who were involved in that awful bus crash in Bacchus Marsh last week. Like so many in my community of Ballarat and across the country, I was pretty shocked to awake to the news and the images of the crash on the Western Highway. It didn't take very long when you saw that it was a Little's bus, when you heard the news that it was an all-girls school, to know exactly where these students and these teachers had come from and the driver. As a parent, it must have been absolutely the stuff of nightmares, leaving in the really early hours of the morning in great enthusiasm. On Wednesday, the 27 Loretto students were to take part in a NASA-run space camp, a trip of a lifetime, initially delayed because of the pandemic. It frankly, when you see the images and you hear about what happened, is absolutely extraordinary that there was no loss of life. I understand the bus actually flipped 4 times, so it is incredible. It is frankly a testament to our emergency services and hospital staff who worked tirelessly all morning to make sure that those injured were safely transported and cared for. I understand the bus company itself also assisted in transporting a number of girls and their parents to hospital in Ballarat. Of the 32 people who sustained injuries in the crash, I know 2 young women, I understand, are still in hospital, with the rest now discharged. It's an incredibly traumatic event to have occurred, and it will have lasting physical and mental health effects on all involved. I'm very grateful for the excellent support services that Loreto have put in place, and it's a very tight-knit community and a very supportive one that I know will wrap their arms around the affected members. I particularly want to say to our paramedics, our police officers, our rescue firefighters, our SES, our tow truck drivers, and of course our nurses and doctors, a heartfelt thank you. It's also an important reminder of the use of seatbelts, without which I am sure the outcome would have been much more disastrous. There will of course be an intensive investigation into the crash. It's important that we let those investigations do their job so we can learn what happened in this accident. My thoughts particularly are with all those involved, but particularly with the 2 young women still in hospital. I know it'll be a long road to recovery, but I do want them to know that all of the community is behind them. You have our very, very best thoughts and care for your recovery in the weeks, months and potentially years ahead. I am so proud of how the young women of Loreto looked after each other, stayed calm and assisted in your own rescue efforts. You're a credit to the school community and a credit to the community of Ballarat.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded, and I call the clerk.
Government business. Order of the day number 1. Death of the Honourable James Joseph Webster. Condolence motion. Resumption of debate on the motion of the Prime Minister.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Nichols.
Thank you. I rise to offer my condolences and to recognise the life and service of the Honourable James Joseph Webster, a senator for the state of Victoria from 1964 to 1980, a national and a fine example of leadership in public policy. Jim Webster joined the Young Country Party in 1940. Later, he was the junior vice president and then the senior vice president of the Victorian branch of the Country Party and was its president in 1963 and 1964. He served on the party's federal council from 1960 to 1964 and was an unsuccessful Country Party candidate for the Legislative Assembly seat of Broadmeadows at the Victorian state elections in 1955. On the 9th of December 1964, at a joint sitting of the Victorian Parliament, Jim Webster was chosen to fill a casual vacancy in the Senate, and he remained a senator until 1980. His elevation to the Senate, even his membership and participation in the Country Party, was remarkable given his background, which included serving as a delegate to the Australian Timber Workers Union while working as a clerk in charge of a log mill at Orbost, and later joining the Waterside Workers Union, where he took up a job on the wharves in Melbourne. While his life prior to entering the Senate had the outward appearance of a contradictory existence, throughout his career he proved to be a champion for the cause of regional Australians. The National's strong and consistent voice for productive agriculture is often misconstrued as being anti-environment, and this ignores the fact that farmers are the stewards of the land and care for it and the surrounding environment. Jim Webster was the Minister for Science and later the Minister for Science and Environment for the Fraser government, not a portfolio usually associated with the Nationals. His achievements include, most notably, his work for Australia's Antarctic research efforts by establishing the National Marine Science Research Centre in Hobart. He twice visited Australian bases and Webster Bay in the Australian territorial section of the Antarctic, and this territorial section was named in his honour. He also established the CSIRO's Australian National Animal Health Laboratory at Geelong, which provided world-class facility for the safe handling of exotic animal diseases. Now known as the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, it remains a critical frontline defence, including against foot and mouth disease, which is an issue as we speak due to outbreaks in Indonesia. Kakadu was declared a national park during his tenure of the Science and Environment portfolio, and whaling was banned in Australian waters. Senator Webster assumed responsibility for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority whose principal function was to recommend areas within the Great Barrier Reef region for declaration as part of the Marine Park, an event that occurred when the Capricornia section was proclaimed in October 1979. Of course, being Minister for Science means you must be across a myriad of issues, not all of them pressing concerns for humanity, like the question as to whether the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation's Division of Radiophysics had, and this is in 1979, the necessary equipment and qualified personnel to carry out a program in search of extraterrestrial intelligence. Senator Webster advised, and I quote, "I have asked the CSIRO to examine the matter, and I advised that the facility at Parkes would be capable of adding basically to research in this area. However, the priorities of the organisation are such that this project is not seen as one which should direct its attention at an early stage." During his time as Minister for Science, Senator Webster did have to pay attention to space. It was in 1979, and the abandoned US space station Skylab was ready to crash back to Earth. Senator Webster told the Herald newspaper that, quote, 21 tonnes of debris consisting of 1,000 of pieces may survive re-entry and impact the Earth's surface. But he calmly reassured readers that the Skylab Communications Centre would coordinate any action required if the spacecraft re-entered the atmosphere over Australia. As history records, Skylab did crash to Earth over Australia, but away from populated areas and without any harm being caused to a single Australian, which was no doubt a great relief to Senator Webster. Jim Webster's Senate biography describes him as a hard-working backbencher and a meticulous minister, reputed to have been in the habit of carrying a 10-centimetre pile of briefing papers into the Senate. He adopted a businessman's approach to the work of the coalition government while remaining an astute country party politician who spoke frequently for and to his electorate. As The Australian observed in 1979, Webster had survived a lengthy court battle aimed at taking him out of the Senate, slipped into the ministry almost by chance, and resisted a number of attempts to replace him. Jim Webster was a great contributor to his party, to the Senate, and to the advancement of good public policy in Australia, particularly in relation to regional Australia, the environment, and scientific endeavour. As one of the newest members of the Nationals in this place, I am honoured to speak today and reflect on his great service, acknowledge some of his many achievements, and offer my condolences to his family. Thank you.
I understand it is the wish of honourable members to signify at this stage their respect and sympathy by rising in their places, and I ask all present to do so. I thank the Federation Chamber.
The proceedings be conducted in the House.
Is leave granted?
Second the motion.
I move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
And seconder?
I'll second
Sorry.
the motion again.
The question is that further proceedings be conducted in the House. All of those opinions say aye. Aye. Against? That is carried. And I call the clerk.
Government business. Next order of the day. Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment, AFP Powers and Other Matters Bill 2022. Resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Bowman.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This bill provides a 12-month extension to AFP counter-terrorism powers that are currently scheduled to sunset on 7th December this year, which is not very long away when you think, when I visited the shops over the course of the weekend, I noticed Christmas decorations were already out. And perhaps there should be some legislation in this place to outlaw that practice this early in the year. But the powers that will sunset on the 7th of December particularly concern stop, search and seizure powers, control orders and preventative detention orders. As the provisions of this bill merely provide an extension of the current AFP powers, there is no financial impact anticipated. The Parliament previously granted these special AFP powers for a very sober reason. that being the existence of probable terrorist threat to Australia and Australians. This threat has not abated. While I think the attention of the Australian public has been somewhat distracted by the recent COVID pandemic and, of course, the ongoing war in the Ukraine, I think that it's very timely that the Parliament consider the extension of these provisions and certainly recognise the fact that the terrorist threat is still out there. It hasn't gone away, even though perhaps the attention of the media and the attention of the Australian public has quite rightly gone on to other newer threats. That threat remains to this day probable. And I'm sure every member of this House believes strongly in safeguarding all basic human rights and freedoms enshrined in law without exception. And while I'm new to this chamber, Deputy Speaker, I also believe, and with some confidence, that all members in this place also hold as our highest priority the obligation to keep Australians safe, especially from those who wish to do us harm, both from abroad and from within. And it is to this end that the Coalition acknowledges the vital importance of maintaining the security architecture that we previously put in place to meet the threat of terrorism on home soil. And for this reason, Deputy Speaker, the opposition is going to be supporting this bill. The Coalition recognises that terrorism presented and still presents, as I've mentioned, an enduring challenge for our social cohesion and personal safety. Australian police and security agencies have a really strong record of successfully defending Australians against such threats. But our success against terrorist threats is highly dependent on having quick, effective and reliable access to the right tools. If you remove these public safety tools from the hands of Australian Federal Police, who have been incredibly responsible in dealing with these powers and utilising them sparingly, when threats do emerge, we certainly can't. We want to make sure that our AFP have these powers at their disposal if needed. In 2014, the Abbott government, following the best security advice, raised the threat level from what was high on the then scale or probable in today's scale. Australia's national terrorism threat has maintained at probable ever since, despite all the changes that we've endured over recent years. This fact, together with the shocking incidents of the intervening years, many successfully averted terrorist threats, highlights the importance of eternal vigilance and the ability to respond with the appropriate tools. The stubborn persistence of the probable threat, together with some appalling incidents which played out on city streets and others prevented just in time from impacting on the Australian community, led the Coalition to decisively enact the current AFP emergency powers regime. And I think it's important to acknowledge the great work that the Australian Federal Police have done over recent decades to defend the Australian community from the threat of terrorism. In Australia, we do an amazing job of recognising the service and the sacrifice of our defence personnel, and I think it's probably an area where we can do a bit more improvement to recognise the work of our police, both at the state and territory levels, but also our federal police, and particularly the amazing job that they've done in handling what are threats that obviously don't recognise, don't enter the consciousness of many Australians, but that the AFP are quietly doing their work in this city and others around Australia to keep us all safe. And I acknowledge that on Thursday we're going to be celebrating or commemorating the Australian Police Remembrance Day. We've lost 11 AFP and Commonwealth Police and peace officers over the course of the history of Australian federal policing. And I think it's important that we take a day out to recognise that and acknowledge the amazing work that they've done under incredibly trying circumstances. In September 2014, the same month Prime Minister Abbott raised the threat level, Australian police carried out the largest counter-terrorism operation in our nation's history, sending 800 armed officers into households across Sydney, across my hometown of Brisbane, to detain Australian citizens that had recently returned from fighting alongside IS militants in the Middle East. One of the men arrested was Omar Jan Azari, who was later charged with conspiracy to commit demonstration killings it was AFP emergency powers, namely the control order regime, being one of the three elements of this bill, implemented by the former coalition government, that ensured that Azari could not communicate with certain people and helped secure his conviction. This is but one of the several examples where AFP's special powers were directly but sparingly used to protect the Australian public in real time against real terrorist threats. And I think that's an important point. We haven't got time to race back into the parliament to legislate when these threats emerge. We need to make sure the AFP have these powers on hand and that they have the ability to use them if needed in the future. And with the threat level still at probable, who knows when that time will come. It's important for the government to introduce this bill and get this bill passed so we can ensure the AFP have these powers beyond the 7 December sunset date. While the Coalition supports the essence of the bill, namely of extending the sunset date to give the government more time to consider recommendations, consult accordingly and draft legislation, we also acknowledge some related concerns. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security report on AFP powers, which was released in October last year, made a total of 19 recommendations, including amendments and additional safeguards, which, if accepted, will mean greater operational complexity for law enforcement. While the appropriateness of certain PJCIS recommendations may not be a direct criticism of this bill, it is nevertheless possible to argue that a greater compliance burden may impact the efficacy of established AFP powers that have only seen rare use in the years since their introduction. While this bill gives effect to a sunset provision to be extended by 1 year, it is important that the issues raised in the PJCIS report be dealt with promptly, and that these emergency powers are given appropriate certainty under law for a realistic period of not less than 3 years. The Coalition supports this bill and urges the Labor government to review and, where feasible, implement the PJCIS recommendations as a matter of urgency. The Coalition recognises the importance of our counter-terrorism measures in 2022, agree that the bill provides for the continuation of key powers that keep Australians safe, and the Coalition acknowledges unanimous PJCIS support for the extension of AFP powers, including stop, search and seizure powers, control order powers and preventative detention order powers for a further 3 years from the sunset date. The Coalition believe that an extra year will allow the government to review the PJCIS report and recommendations, consult widely and draft relevant legislation to extend this further. The Coalition members and senators will certainly monitor the Labor government's actions closely to ensure that they keep their promise to consult widely with the community and other stakeholders, as well as state and territory governments, something at which they have been historically quite poor. We trust that despite Labor's propensity to leverage state power in the lives of individuals, these special powers will remain special, targeted and infrequent in their use. Collectively, under the Coalition, these powers were only ever used sparingly. Only 23 control orders were issued over the past 8 years, and while no preventative detention orders have ever been made, nor have there been any incidents that required emergency stop, search and seizure powers, the AFP have done an incredible job in ensuring that these powers were exercised sparingly and appropriately. We need to be careful when it comes to balancing these powers, and the Coalition accepts that it may take a little more time to get the balance right in any new legislation, and therein lies the obligation. This Labor government must do just that and ensure that the same level of balance that the Coalition achieved in such a critical area of government responsibility. If Labor turns the dial down too far, then the life and property of Australians may be at risk. But if they turn the dial too far the other way, then individual freedoms may be impacted. The Coalition recognised that while the media focus of recent years has been on other issues such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the threat of terrorism has certainly not gone away. As I've mentioned, it's certainly departing the consciousness of the public very quickly. I do note that it doesn't seem to appear in discussion around election debates anymore. This isn't an issue that gathers the news headlines as it did 10 or even 20 years ago. But while the immediate attention has gone away, our terror threat level remains at that very high probable rating. And while we continue to face a probable threat, the existing AFP powers, which have proven to be very effective short and medium-term powers to investigate, prevent and contain that threat, should be continued through this bill. The Coalition believes that the minimal use of these powers over the past 8 years demonstrates that, provided an appropriate balance is maintained, they will not be misused. I call on the Labor government to use the extra time afforded by this bill wisely. They should consult wisely. They should read those recommendations from the committee very closely and do it early in this extra year that's been given. Use the opportunity. Why not have some legislation early in the new year to extend these provisions even further than kicking it down the road just another 12 months, because this threat certainly isn't going away. The threat of the probable threat level has been there for years, and there's no saying as to how long that threat's going to be hanging over us. This government must ensure that an effective and transparent suite of special AFP powers is maintained to keep Australians safe and to safeguard human rights and freedoms above all. I trust that the government will take that appropriate action, and certainly I know the Coalition members will be keen to hold the government to account to ensure that we do get a very good outcome here in the new year, and that these measures are appropriately implemented, not just over the next 12 months, but over the long term. I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak in support of the counter-terrorism bill before the House, which, as has been made clear, is essentially about extending certain powers that have been provided now for a few years to the Australian Federal Police, and they are due to expire this December, and this extends that expiration for another 12 months and allows time for the recommendations that the PJCIS has given to government to be implemented, as well as some further consultation with other law enforcement agencies here in the various state jurisdictions. And of course, whilst being very happy to support this extension in this case, these powers are quite significant, and they are ones that we should always hesitate around fully convincing ourselves of their necessity. And I certainly am convinced of the necessity of these powers that are being extended. But nonetheless, it's a very important part of the social compact in this country between our law enforcement agencies and the powers they have, and any new powers that are given to them, or new capabilities that are given to them, that we equally are doing that in an environment where there is a deep amount of community trust, that those powers will be used appropriately with great discretion, and that they are indeed absolutely necessary to keep us safe. We as parliamentarians in a democracy need to absolutely ensure that we're always being very mindful and very wary of giving capability to law enforcement that could run the risk of removing people's liberties or putting them in a position that's not fair in our society without extremely good reason. And the three, well, the overview of the three powers are, when exercised, the sorts of powers that do impugn the liberty of the citizens of this country, and we need to set a very high standard for the need for that. Stop, search and seizure obviously is something that we don't expect in a normal situation for an Australian to expect to be the case without a strong case of probable cause. And equally, control orders put in place over people and preventative detention orders are also, of course, powers that seem on the face of them to be quite significant, perhaps even extreme. And they would be in circumstances not related to terrorism and the threat of terrorism. And I do absolutely support the need, the requirement, when we're dealing with the risk of terrorism and terrorist acts, for us to be equipping the Australian Federal Police with appropriate capability beyond what they can do in other circumstances in undertaking their law enforcement obligations in this country, to have some enhanced powers, put them in the position to best protect us from the threat of terrorism. In about 2 weeks' time, I think it's the 12th of October, we have the 20th anniversary of the Bali bombings, and unfortunately this parliament won't be sitting on that date, and so I certainly take the opportunity at this point to remember the Australians that were killed and injured in those terrorist attacks in Bali 20 years ago. We've also had a little more than, or around about a year ago, a little over a year ago, commemorated the 20th anniversary of the September 11 terrorist attacks on the United States, where Australians lost their life. Of course, thousands of Americans were killed in those attacks. And the counter-terrorism framework in this country really has been completely overhauled, enhanced and re-engineered since that epochal moment on the 11th of September 2001, where all of us lost some of our comfort about the world that we lived in, and some of the reassurance that we sort of lost a sense that things could happen only in some parts of the world and not anywhere in the world. And when two planes flew into two buildings in Lower Manhattan, I think I certainly remember feeling, as part of many emotions at the time, that there's nothing different about New York City than Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Adelaide or anywhere in this country, in Australia. And really, as a planet, we all responded very significantly to a world that was going to be changed forever because of those events. And unfortunately, not just Australians that died in September 11, but of course the other terrorist attacks that have occurred since then. I mentioned the Bali bombings, and there have been others around the world, of course, at times that have claimed the lives of Australians. London Bridge attacks, Australians killed there, and I was in London at the time. Frankly, it was just a terrible experience to think being so close, adjacent to a terrorist attack that occurred at that point. So it is a very serious risk, and unfortunately it is ever present with us. And frankly, it would be unforgivable for us to, as a parliament, to ever think, oh look, it's been a while now since anything happened of a serious magnitude, or nothing too serious has happened in this country, or since the Lindt Cafe siege, whatever. We can never ever, unfortunately, decide that will ever be truly safe again, and that we can ever stand down from that posture, and we pay such tribute to the people on the front line of keeping us safe against the threat of terrorism. And unfortunately, they are going to have to be at that heightened sense of alert really in perpetuity. I just don't ever see a time where we won't be able to, where we'll ever be able to say the threat of some form of terrorist attack in our society is no longer something that we see as being likely or possible. So in that context, this extension is appropriate, and the previous speaker, and I'm sure other speakers on this bill will also make the point, it is, I think that it is pleasing how infrequently, in some cases not at all, these powers that the AFP have been given have ever had to have been used. And that is quite reassuring to me from 2 points of view. The first is that it is a relief that there aren't risks that the AFP are identifying on a regular basis that mean they have to use these powers. I think that's a good thing. I'd love for them to never have to use these powers, despite the importance of them having access to the powers. And it also gives me comfort that they are not abusing these powers and that they are not looking at these powers as opportunities to reach beyond their reasonable remit in doing what they do to keep us safe from terrorism and the threat of terrorism. Like other speakers, I am anxious that the government does complete fairly rapidly. Certainly, I think this 12-month extension hopefully is the only extension that they need. I really do pay tribute to the Joint Standing Committee on the Intelligence Services and the work that they do, and how vital it is, and we can see it with legislation like this, how vital it is that we have a real bipartisanship around these issues. And I know my good friend, the member for Fishes, now serves on that committee, and I'm sure that there'll be a contribution from him around the importance of the work there, and also that we can put our trust and faith in some of our members. It can't be all of us, obviously. It's got to be some of our members that can be on a committee like that, where they do get access to important information that is necessary for them to have a confidence that legislation that will come to the Parliament is necessary. We can't ask certain questions, particularly in the public domain, of the executive of government when they come and seek certain powers that we might think, well, we'd love some justification for this. We equally can't ask that in the public domain, in a public setting, and it is vital that there's a proper structure that is linked to the Parliament that is able to be brought into sometimes extremely confidential information that absolutely must be protected and kept confidential from a national security point of view, but also gives them a confidence as to why our agencies and our government is asking for certain powers to be provided to them. And that mechanism does give me great comfort that when we're asked to vote on this type of legislation, where there is a lot of information that probably does support the need for legislative change or legislative enactment, that at the same time can't be provided to every member of Parliament, that we have a mechanism like PJSIS that means many of our colleagues, or an appropriate number of our colleagues, can be given proper briefings on the basis of the extremely necessary confidentiality and protection of that information, so that they can say to colleagues like myself, and not serving on that committee, that they have felt justified in the need for these powers. And of course, these powers were enacted under the former government, and we've now got a new government and a new executive that are saying, yes, indeed, these powers need to be extended. We've sensibly had these sunset clauses on these powers so that it is coming back to the Parliament on a regular basis, and I believe the intention is to put a more permanent arrangement in place once we're flowing out of a process from PJSIS and work that they've done to put something more permanent in place, and with the appropriate consultation with state law enforcement authorities and the like. So on that basis, I am very much comfortable in supporting something which I have a natural trepidation towards, that I think does need to meet a very high standard of justification, because these are very significant powers that we would ordinarily be quite nervous about providing to any government agency. But I do believe that when it comes to counter-terrorism and equipping them with the necessary powers that they need to do their job, as long as members of the Parliament have been given a strong justification through an appropriate way that I've just outlined, I think that we should be backing and supporting the Australian Federal Police and equip them with the necessary powers they need to keep us safe from terrorism. I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I congratulate the member for Sturt on a well-researched and well-delivered speech on a very important topic. Madam Deputy Speaker, I do rise in support of the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment, AFP Powers and Other Matters Bill of 2022. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's an often quoted phrase that the condition upon which, there's an often quoted phrase of the eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And that phrase is often ascribed to Thomas Jefferson. But the first person that's purported to have said that dates back to 1790. And it was an Irishman, John Philpot Curran, who said, "The condition upon which God hath given liberty to man is eternal vigilance." And that pretty much sums up the importance of this bill. The bill provides for the continuation of counter-terrorism powers held by the AFP, which are due to sunset on the 7th of December of this year. This bill seeks to extend those powers until December of 2023. These are powers which the previous coalition government implemented in 2021 as part of our extensive work to strengthen Australia's national security. By extending the sunsetting date by 12 months, the government and the opposition can reach a bipartisan position on new legislation to amend Part 5.3 of the Criminal Code Act of 1995 based on the recommendations of the PJCIS, on which I am very proud to serve as the Deputy Chair. The previous member speaking, the member for Sturt, spoke at some length about the importance of the PJCIS, and I've only been on the committee for a very short while, and I do want to take this opportunity to commend the outstanding work that has been done by my immediate predecessor, or the immediate chair of the committee, Senator James Paterson. As I said, I've only been on the committee for a short while, but his depth of knowledge in relation to intelligence and security is really quite remarkable. And I also want to acknowledge the work of the now Shadow Minister for Defence, the member for Canning, who preceded Senator Paterson. Both these gentlemen have done outstanding work in their work on the PJCIS. The PJCIS is perhaps the most important committee in this place. It provides much needed oversight over our intelligence agencies. And, you know, we live in a parliamentary democracy which is constantly under threat. But it is very important that if we have these very significant powers, that our security agencies have these powers, it is important that we have appropriate checks and balances on our security agencies. And the PJCIS, along with the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, perform these roles of checks and balances over our intelligence and security architecture in this country. Now, we should never fall victim to any form of hubris when it comes to terrorism or national security. This country, sadly, is constantly at threat of terrorist attacks by those who would seek to do us harm, whether they are state-based actors or lone wolf actors. It is very important that that our security agencies have the sort of powers which I'll go through shortly, but it is equally important that we have appropriate checks and balances on those agencies to ensure that, that they conduct themselves appropriately within the confines of the law, and that any potential overreach is dealt with. As we discussed yesterday, we acknowledged the National Police Remembrance Week. We have a great responsibility in this place, and I believe in our broader community, to recognise the importance of the work that is done by our policing services, both at a state and territory level and, importantly, at a federal level. Australia's national terrorism threat today remains at probable. There's credible intelligence assessed by Australia's security agencies indicating that malicious actors have the intent and capability to conduct a terrorist act in Australia. This bill will provide for the continuation of key counter-terrorism powers reserved for the AFP to keep Australians safe. All powers will continue to be subject to robust safeguards and oversight, as I said earlier, with the PJCIS and the Inspector General for Intelligence and Security overseeing those agencies. The bill extends the sunset clause by 12 months in relation to three key powers. They are control orders, prevention detention orders, and emergency stop and seizure powers. Now, in relation to the control orders, these are provisions which allow the Federal Court or the Federal Circuit Court to impose an order which places tailored obligations, prohibitions and restrictions on an individual who continues to present a risk to the community. A preventative detention order allows a person to be detained without charge and can only be used where the AFP reasonably suspects that an attack could occur within 14 days or in the aftermath of a terrorist attack to preserve vital evidence. In relation to the emergency stop, search and seizure powers, these provisions allow police to request a person's name, address and other details. They allow police to conduct a search for a terrorism-related item and to seize such an item, and they allow police to enter premises without a warrant to prevent a serious and imminent threat to a person's life, health or safety. Now, some would argue that these provisions, these orders, are draconian in nature, that take away people's liberty. And that is correct, they do. But this is the nature of the serious threat that this country faces and, in fact, many Western countries face. And these are provisions that we would rather not have. But in order to keep Australians safe, this parliament and previous parliaments have considered that they are vital, with appropriate checks and balances. Now, to date, Madam Deputy Speaker, no preventative detention orders have been made and no incidents have required the use of the emergency stop, search and seizure powers. Although these powers have not been used to date, this actually demonstrates that the AFP are very judicious in their application of these far and broad powers, far-reaching and broad powers. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would suggest to this chamber that Australians can and in fact should be very proud of the members of the ADF. Of the AFP. They should also be proud of the ADF, of course. But confining my remarks to the AFP, for 43 of the last 75 years, the AFP have contributed to global peacekeeping efforts and supporting Australia's role in maintaining law and order at home and abroad. Thanks to the previous coalition government's record investment in the work of the AFP and our nation's law enforcement and security agencies, Australia has led groundbreaking operations and international partnerships to make our country, our region and our world safer. Madam Deputy Speaker, consider Operation Ironside. This was a sophisticated sting, or was a sophisticated sting with the FBI that targeted the criminal underworld and saw more than 350 local arrests, 6.3 tonnes of drugs seized and 6 drug labs shut down. Consider Operation Vader, which took down 2 global narcotic crime syndicates spanning across 5 countries. Once again, Operation Appleby. It's the largest counter-terror probe in Australia, which took down a Sydney terror cell. And consider the vital work of the Australian Centre to Combat Child Exploitation, which I had the privilege of visiting just a couple of weeks ago. The AFP, through the ACE, is leading the world in employing new technology and tactics to protect our children, and has resulted in over 2,700 charges being laid against predators and consumers of child abuse material. And today, Madam Deputy Speaker, just in the last few days we have learnt about the cyber attack on Optus. The Australian Signals Directorate, along with the AFP, are working closely together with Optus to try and identify the culprits under Operation Hurricane, together with overseas law enforcement agencies, to investigate this hack, this threat that's exposed almost 10 million Australians and their private information. So the AFP are at the cutting edge in relation to not just the protection of children, but certainly in relation to cybersecurity and many other endeavours. I was listening with great interest when the member for Sturt was talking about his experience in London when the terrorist attacks were happening in London. And it reminded me of how Leonie and I were in Melbourne one Christmas time, and we were staying in a hotel, and literally we were in the hotel and all hell broke loose just across the road at the Federation Square. I can't remember the year, it would have been about 10 years ago. And as it turned out, AFP and Victorian Police pounced on some would-be terrorists and thwarted a terrorist attack. I think it was on the 23rd of December. It's my anniversary date, so I remember the date. It was the 23rd of December, about 10 years ago. And it really brought home, because it was actually at Federation Square, and the police intervened seemingly with moments to spare. And it really brought home to me that what we saw in New York and Washington and London can very well happen here in Australia. And of course we saw that with the terrorist attack at the Lindt store in Sydney. So for anyone who thinks that Australia is immune or somehow is quarantined from the risk that we have seen in other terrorist attacks in other countries around the world, such as in the US and the UK, that is a very, very dangerous presumption to hold. All Western democracies are at risk in the face of terrorism. It is true that terrorism has taken a back seat in recent times to seemingly more pressing issues such as COVID and the threats that we face from a geopolitical perspective. But terrorism. There are still those who are out there within our own communities, both from a religious perspective and a right-wing perspective, that seek to do Australians harm, and this bill will continue the protections that Australians deserve for another 12 months, and I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. I rise today to speak for the people of North Sydney on the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment, AFP Powers and Other Matters Bill 2022. The introduction of this bill provides an important opportunity for the 47th Parliament to review, reflect and comment on this crucial area of law, which sits at the nexus between safety and freedom and between security and respect for human rights. It is undeniable that both are fundamental to society. It is undeniable that both are fundamental to the society that we all wish to live in and want to create for our children. But it is also undeniable that this is a delicate balance to strike in a rapidly changing and complicated world. As the late Margaret Stone AO, formerly a Justice of the Federal Court of Australia and Inspector General of Intelligence and Security from August 2015 until her retirement in August 2020, said, "The tension between secret intelligence and civil liberties and rights is not reconcilable. Inevitably, secrecy threatens rights, and rights weaken secrecy." In these circumstances, I note the purpose of the government's proposed amendment bill to extend for 12 months the sunsetting dates for stop, search and seizure powers, control orders and preventative detention orders. This extension is for the express purpose of giving the government time to consult on and then implement its response to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security's bipartisan recommendations following its report represented to Parliament in October 2021. This is a significant undertaking. The committee has made numerous recommendations. Key stakeholders, including the Law Council of Australia and the Australian Human Rights Commission, have previously raised real concerns about extending these exceptional powers. Using control orders as a case in point, once executed, these orders can last for 12 months and prevent a person from associating or communicating with specified individuals or accessing technology, including the internet. They can require a person to participate in specified counselling or education, to remain at specified premises between specified times on specified days for up to 12 hours a day, and to wear a tracking device. All if a court decides the allegation is more likely than not, a much lower standard of proof than that required to start a criminal prosecution. Preventative detention orders allow police to detain people secretly for up to 2 weeks, if, for example, there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the person will engage in a terrorist act, if that person possesses a thing connected with the preparation for a terrorist act, or if that person has done an act in preparation for a terrorist act. Basically, if the person is even suspected of being able to do something like that. Yet the detainee is not required to be informed of the reasons for their detention, is not entitled to contact any person except a family member or similar to let them know that they are safe but not able to be contacted for the time being, and is subject to having all communications with their lawyer monitored. This is the stuff of Hollywood fiction. Look no further than the Steven Spielberg movie Minority Report to see it play out on big screens. To give just one example of how concerning I know this is for my constituency, one of my constituents was so concerned by the rushed passage of the legislation and the strenuous objections of the Law Council of Australia and of the Telecommunications Amendment Bill, known colloquially as the Mandatory Metadata Retention Bill, that in addition to calling her local member, she wrote individually to every senator of New South Wales to express her alarm and consternation. That bill introduced one of the most comprehensive and intrusive data collection schemes in the Western world. So where do we currently stand, and how does that compare to the legislative framework of similar or equivalent nations? In the 22 years since 9/11, Australia has enacted more than 130 pieces of national security legislation. No other nation can match the volume of Australia's counter-terrorism laws. But it's not just the volume of the legislation that's noteworthy. The time spent considering the laws in draft before they are enacted is becoming shorter and shorter. The original anti-terrorism laws in 2002 took many months to be considered before enactment. Now, the speed with which laws are passed has led to one of the world's leading experts in counter-terrorism laws, Professor Kent Roach of the Toronto University, to describe Australia's approach as hyper-legislation. The speed was fastest under the Howard government, when a new counter-terrorism law was passed on average every 6.7 weeks. The law preventing live streaming of terrorist acts, introduced after the Christchurch massacre, took just a week or so. This haste should concern us all, for, as our third independent national security legislation monitor, Dr James Renwick, CSCSC, noted, speed in passing laws can sometimes be necessary, but it brings the risk of error and overreach. In Australia, we are particularly vulnerable to overreach because, unlike other jurisdictions, we do not have a Bill of Rights. This means the government has been able to enact counter-terrorism laws that would not be possible anywhere else in the world. For example, the mandatory detention of Australians' telecommunications metadata for 2 years would not be possible in the EU. The European Court of Human Rights has held that a blanket retention for that period of time infringes a basic right to privacy. Similarly, in a review of counter-terrorism laws in 2013, the Council of Australian Governments reported that preventative detention orders were more likely to be seen in discredited totalitarian regimes. An additional concern is how far the balance has moved, in Margaret Stone's words, from rights to secrecy. Our hyper-legislation enables and entrenches high levels of secrecy. It is a crime to mention basic details about the use of many counter-terrorism powers, or even the mere fact that they were used. These offences pose a serious risk to journalists and whistleblowers. Few would forget the dramatic days of raids by the Australian Federal Police of journalists at the ABC and News Corp in 2019, which prompted outrage and drew international attention to Australia's draconian secrecy laws. In relation to whistleblowers, the recent prosecutions of Bernard Collery and Witness K, shrouded in secrecy and even conducted in closed court, provide examples of these tensions at work. As the decision of the ACT Court of Appeal in the Collery case makes clear, the open hearing of criminal trials is important because it deters political prosecutions and allows the public to scrutinise the actions of both the prosecutors and the accused. Although no one would dispute the need for counter-terrorism laws, we must also maintain the trust and avoid the persecution of minority communities, and avoid transgressing rights to the point that grievances lead to radicalisation. The risk of getting the balance wrong and excessively eroding our human rights in the pursuit of protection from terrorism could ironically and tragically make us less safe. As a former UN Secretary-General, Kofi Annan, said in 2005, compromising human rights cannot serve the struggle against terrorism. On the contrary, it facilitates achievement of the terrorist objective. These are complex and vital issues for our society, well deserving of the extension of time sought by the government to review, consult and reform. Counter-terrorism legislation measures should be justified as necessary, proportionate and consistent with the rule of law of principles. This is an important time to remind all of us sitting as members in the 47th Australian Parliament of Dr Renwick's salutary warning. While these laws are often controversial in principle and almost always contestable as to their terms, they seem to have become permanent. Over time, what was once seen as extraordinary laws has become acceptable as normal. This bill provides an opportunity to revisit the permanence of our hyper-legislation. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Banks.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to speak on this very important legislation, and there's nothing more important than our national security. And we have, as a nation, in the past had to confront the evil of terrorism, and it is important that we reflect on these laws and fully consider them in this chamber. And I wanted to make, I guess, 5 key points, Deputy Speaker. The first is obviously that terrorism in recent years has been something something of a less prominent focus than it has in public debate in years prior. Much of the debate in recent years in the security setting has been about counter-espionage, which, of course, the previous government moved passed some very important legislation in relation to countering foreign interference in Australia. So espionage has been a big focus, as indeed have been broader concerns about geopolitical issues in our region. So there's been less public focus, certainly, on terrorism than there was some years ago. But it's certainly the case that the perverse ideologies of terrorism haven't gone away. And there are still people who want to act upon those ideologies. And there are various strands of that. But those people are out there, and we must never, ever gloss over that extremely important fact. Evil exists in the world, and sometimes its manifestation is through terrorism. So we need to be conscious of that. And then I think the central question on legislation like this is, of course, the balance between civil liberties and the protection of the broader community. And that's, I guess, a centuries-old area of focus. Because when you do put in place strong laws to protect against terrorism, you almost inevitably have some impact on civil liberties. And it's an issue on which debates will be had and people will put forward their views and so on. But I think, for me, we should always err on the side of protection. We should always err on the side of caution, because the consequence of terrorism is so horrendous on our community. We're not talking about something that has a minor impact. We're talking about something which, if it happens, has a devastating impact on our community. And laws which enable our AFP and others to be on the front foot in protecting our community against terrorism should broadly be supported. This isn't an academic issue. We have seen terrorist plots, both plots that have been averted and plots that very sadly have come to fruition and have led to the loss of life in Australia. We remember the very serious plot involving the Holsworthy Barracks, not far from my electorate in Sydney, the Endeavour Hills incident in Melbourne, of course the horrific siege of the Lindt Cafe, the terrorist murder in Parramatta, and the evil terrorist incident in Bourke Street in Melbourne. So that's a list of 5 right there. Very, very serious terrorist plots, some of which came to fruition, leading to the loss of life. So this isn't theoretical, it isn't academic, it's very real and it's very serious. And so for policymakers, the question is, on which side do you err? Because there is an inevitable tension between civil liberties and protection. I think one should err on the side of protection. And in the context of the debate that the legislation we're talking about today, it's particularly important to note, and I'll come in a moment to the 3 key provisions, although I don't propose to extensively repeat the contributions of earlier speeches, but in the 3 key elements of the legislation that we're talking about today, 2 of those powers have never been used. 2 of those powers have never been used, and we have some examples of the other power being used in a fashion which was effective and has actually led to the imprisonment of 2 people. So it's very difficult to make an argument here that there's a disproportionality in the legislation, given that 2 out of 3 provisions haven't been used. So reasonable to raise civil liberties concerns, but hard to have a civil liberties problem if the law isn't in fact being exercised. So that was my my fourth point, and the fifth sort of broad point I wanted to make is that it is manifestly in Australia's interest that laws of this nature, wherever possible, are bipartisan. It is not in our national interest to, in my view, politicise or seek to make political capital out of these sorts of matters. And I think the good thing about the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security is it seems over many years under different chairs and under different compositions to have achieved that. And that's really good. It doesn't always happen in this place. And there are many areas where a robust and forceful and public disagreement is often a good thing and leads to better policy. But this is an area where bipartisanship is to be preferred wherever possible. So what the government is saying here is we've got a big report from the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. It's 114 pages long. It's got 19 recommendations. And the government, I think quite sensibly, is saying, well, let's go through this carefully. Let's not rush the response to that. Let's balance the civil liberties concerns and the concerns about the protection of the Australian people, and let's do that over a 12-month process. And it seems to me that that is a very sensible thing. We don't have a scenario where there is evidence of these laws being misused or anything of that nature. So it seems to me it's inherently sensible. And as my colleagues have touched on before, there's three key elements of the bill: the control orders that allow, in some circumstances, for people to be held if there is a reasonable fear that those persons may be planning or seeking to implement an act of terrorism. Those control orders have led to two people being jailed for breaching of control orders, one as recently as earlier this year, and in both cases they were people that had been involved in the planning of terrorist acts. So I think the Australian community would be very supportive of the use of those laws in that circumstance. And then a preventative detention where someone can be held without charge is obviously a very serious thing to do, where the AFP suspects that an attack is imminent, and in the aftermath of a terrorist attack to preserve evidence. Never been used. A sensible provision. I'm glad that it's on the books, but it's never been used. And then the emergency stop and seizure powers under the Crimes Act, which again allow the police to take action where they perceive a serious and imminent threat to a person's life, health or safety. And there are a whole bunch of safeguards as to how that power can be exercised, and again hasn't actually been used. So certainly not a civil rights issue if it hasn't been used, but it's good that it's there. It's good that the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security has done such thorough and thoughtful work in reviewing this legislation, and I think it is eminently sensible of the government to take its time to carefully review that in the intervening 12 months, leave in place the laws which are working effectively, and then come back to this Parliament in 12 months' time with proposals as to how to further improve those laws. And in doing so, the government's key motivation should be the protection of the Australian people, because there is nothing more important than that.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill, of course, is about the extension of temporary arrangements to enable the Parliament to act on the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence Security recommendations for tightening the permanent legislation. It is a priority, but it should not be rushed. And I note the comments for the member for North Sydney when she she warned that we should not indefinitely have temporary arrangements and that we should be wary of encroachment on our civil liberties. And I agree with her. I think these are sound points. We do live in a precarious world, and who would have thought 20, 25, 40 years ago that we would find ourselves with the kind of restrictions in our lives that we accept now for the public good. And to be fair, Australia has been spared many of the terrorist acts that have happened around the world. So I'm not critical of where we've arrived at. I'm certainly critical of those that have forced us into these positions. But in this case, I think it's right that we should extend this temporary legislation for another 12 months while a proper and correct consideration is given to that report. It comes to three main points, and I'm indebted to the former member for detailing them. I'll try not to take up too much time, but of course the control orders basically allow for the restrictions on people who are deemed to be a risk to our community, and they have been used. The prevention detention orders is for detaining people without charge for firstly 24 hours and then with special approval for another 24 hours where an attack is imminent. And I don't think that many of us would argue about the need for that. I'm pleased that we haven't had to use it. And of course the emergency stop and seizure powers, once again not being used, but fairly self-descriptive, the ability to act without a warrant when imminent danger presents itself to the Australian public. Now, in a perfect world, we would have none of this, absolutely none of it. We're a liberal, high-functioning liberal democracy, but we are forced into the positions by those who bear us bad will. The world has changed over that last 20 or 40 years I spoke about. International travel, instant communications, instant telecommunications, worldwide objectives of terrorist groups. There was a time when people that had local conflict, local arguments, would keep their arguments and conflicts local. But with the diasporas that are spread around the world, with the constant movement of people, they are able to take up their arguments in other places. And so it's changed, and we've had little choice. Now, make no mistake, Madam Deputy Speaker, individuals, groups, religious and political zealots hate countries like Australia, and they mean us harm. They hate us because we're free to choose who we associate with, free to practice our religion of choice, free to educate our children in an institution of our choice, the ability to participate in our democracies, to say and do as we wish, unless, of course, it negatively impacts on others, and we have appropriate laws for those circumstances. For those who wish to attack us, they seek to reshape the world to suit their view, to make us succumb to their will, and we are their enemy. We should not think in Australia we are safe from this. The Economist publishes an annual democracy table. There are 195 countries in the world. 167 of them are assessed by The Economist. I don't know what the other 20 or so countries, I haven't been able to find them yet. But of those 167 countries, just 34 are deemed to be full democracies. Just 34. And they only cover about 6% of the world's population. We are so indeed fortunate in Australia, let me say. In these democracies like Australia, we have civil liberties and political freedoms, valid systems of government checks, independent judiciaries, a free press. And Australia on this list of 34 is 13th. Thought we might do a bit better, but it's pretty good, 13th in the world. There are 47 with deficient democracies. They do have free and fair elections, but they have fundamental deficiencies like pressure on their press, suppression of critics and opponents, underdeveloped political cultures, low levels of participation in politics. Then there are 29 more in moderate autocracies. They have a regular electoral frauds, preventing them from being free or fair. They commonly have government applying pressure to oppositions, non-independent judiciaries, widespread corruption, pressure on media, anemic rules of laws, and that includes countries like Iran. And given the death of the tragic death of Mahsa Amini, and we've been all watching it on our news at the moment, and the riots that are happening in Iran, one would wonder how much longer Iran will stay on that list before they drop to the hard autocracies. And I might also point out that Russia sits on that list. The next list is 21 hard autocracies. These are the absolute monarchies or dictatorships that have sham elections, controlled courts and press. They include China and North Korea. Now, you might ask, Madam Deputy Speaker, why I list these in a debate about terrorism. But it's simply because, apart from some fairly notable exceptions like Afghanistan, most of the terrorist attacks in the world are aimed at these fully functioning democracies, at the 6% of people who are fortunate to live in a fully functioning democracies, and they include Australia. And I went through before why these forces of evil, if you like, these forces who wish to push their will upon the world, so detest countries like Australia. So if we look at a few of them, in the last few years France has had multiple attacks. You remember well, you will remember well, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, the satirical newspaper. 12 dead for publishing a cartoon. A teacher beheaded for giving a lesson in tolerance. Police stabbed to death. That France has an extensive list of terrorist attacks. Belgium, little old Belgium, bombings. In 2016, 32 civilians were killed, 300 injured. Stabbings, attacks on police. Canada, we remember well the attack on the Canadian Parliament, where a police officer was killed in action on the steps of Parliament House. In Germany, in 2018, Germany reported 1,088 violent crimes committed by extremists, bomb attacks on mosques, extreme anti-Semitic activities. Great concern. In the UK, remember the slaying of Joe Cox MP in 2016 by a white supremacist. Huge list of attacks the UK has throughout the last decade: car bombs, train bombings, mosques. They have it all, basically. The US, who can forget the Twin Towers, the attacks on the Pentagon? Perhaps the world's #1 target, the US. In a 2017 report, they reported 95 deaths and 932 injuries associated with terrorism, singularly in that year. I might point out, it was a bit of a surprise to me that US just missed out on being a fully functioning democracy on a point system. They are one outside that bridge of 34, but I think they're well worth throwing in these as examples of what Australia potentially face. So, of all of these examples, apart from that one, they are listed as full democracies, and I remind the House that Australia is number 13 out of 34, so we are well within the sights of those who wish democracies and light and liberalism around the world harm. We are well within our sights. So while we are not immune, we will remember in Australia the Bali bombings in 2002, which killed 202 people, 20 years ago, 88 Australians. The Bali bombings in 2005, once again targeting Australians amongst others, but 23 dead, 4 of those Australian. The siege in the Lindt Cafe, it's been raised before, there were 3 deaths there. So we are not immune, and and to their great credit, our federal police and security forces have thwarted a number of other attempts in Australia, and we have been at the lower ebb. We're extremely fortunate in Australia. We have good agencies. We have the separation of distance and a whole lot of other things going for us, and a multicultural community that lives together in peace. But we are well to be advised to be on our guard. So because unless we are prepared, we cannot take for granted our safety from religious and political zealots worldwide who are determined. Just in finishing up, one of the things that does concern me associated is that while we have done well in thwarting terrorism, in fact, and hopefully driving it back, in fact, we cede ground. Every time they succeed, we lose a little too, because our community is now beset with huge costs that are associated with, for instance, with airport screening, things that we would never have imagined 30 years ago, with costs associated with all kinds of security around public events, indeed security around this place in which we speak today. All of those are at an added cost to that would have been envisaged when this building was built, for instance. So it does come at a cost, and it does come as a small sacrifice of our personal freedoms, as I touched on at the beginning of this speech, and that's why these, wherever possible, should be temporary measures. If they can't be temporary, well, then they should be properly thought through, investigated, and that's what, of course, this extension of this existing legislation will allow us to do.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also wish to rise and speak on the counter-terrorism legislation amendment, AFP Powers and Other Matters bill. And the bill is basically to allow the extension of the powers for another 12 months. And this sunset clause is something very important that it is continued. The legislation is something, I go back to my first days when I was elected back in 2004. It was in the Howard government. This legislation was actually introduced regarding control orders, preventative detention orders and emergency stop and seizure powers. And sometimes we actually forget why these laws are required. We obviously think back to September 11, but Australia has been very fortunate, if I can say, due to the magnificent detective work and our law enforcement agencies combined with intelligence agencies have just done an incredible job to protect Australians over the years. We go back to the Benbrika matter, where he was charged with a number of other in fact, young people who were planning terrorist attacks over Melbourne. By memory, it was the MCG and Federation Square. And Benbrika was a person who was actually booted out of the Preston Mosque, had a very extremist views. And then what he did, he actually cultivated and used young people to recruit and plan to commit these attacks. By memory, it was called Operation Pegasus. And as I said, if it wasn't for the great law enforcement work, we would have had these awful terrorist attacks, as I said, MCG, Federation, other places. And also legislation has since been put in place to keep high-risk terrorist offenders behind bars. And I note this was actually legislation fought for very hard by our now opposition leader, who is previously the Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton. And Benbrika, again, has been kept under or in custody, in prison, for the simple reason he hasn't changed his ways and views. And if he does get out, he will be of high risk to the community. Now, I just also want to... Sometimes we forget, as I said, the great work of detectives across the country. And I was going through my speeches I've made when it comes to counter-terrorism, and it's just a reminder, some members of the House of Reps, I know the Greens have opposed every single piece of legislation when it comes to counter-terrorism measures, but back in 2016, again, police foiled terrorist attacks, and these were awful attacks planned on Anzac Day, and they were planned to stab and shoot police officers and members of the public. And I remember, and I'm just quoting from a speech at the time back in December 2016, how alert and cautious the police were that year in 2016 for their own safety. One of those charged was Sevet Bism, 19 years of age, and that's the thing. Young people are often recruited in the world of terrorism. And after his plan was forward, he pleaded guilty to a plot to run over and then behead a police officer before using a gun in a rampage. In the Victorian Supreme Court, September 2016, Bassem was given a 10-year jail sentence and must serve at least 7.5 years. There was also other matters, advanced plans to kidnap members of the public in Sydney and Brisbane and behead them on camera and release the footage. Absolutely shocking. And 2 schoolboys were preparing a terrorist attack in Sydney southwest with police alleging they had links to Islamic State. They were arrested, refused bail. And there was also a plan to detonate bombs on Mother's Day running event. So again, I thank law enforcement agencies for the great work they've done. But we go back to the Howard days when this legislation came in place. When it comes to control orders, sometimes members and the public don't really actually understand the need and use of control orders. Control orders have been used when, for example, police have a person, they may be waiting a court case, they haven't been remanded in custody. Most of the times they would be remanded in custody or released, and there's still concerns about them. They'll be required to potentially wear a leg bracelet to monitor their behaviour. It could be 2 orders are made that they cannot use social media, go in contact with other people. The control orders, by memory, are in place for, I believe, a 12-month period. To be honest, something else I've been fighting for a number of years is what I call a community-based order, because I had this in the case of Newman Hayter, who tried to stab Mr Deputy Speaker, 2 police at Endeavour Hills Police Station. Now, Newman Hayter was a person who was hanging around the Dandenong shopping centre with then at the time the IS flag. Police didn't really have any powers to charge him, just to move him on from the shopping centre. Law enforcement, the 2 officers, and I've actually met them in the past, arranged to meet with him at the Endeavour Hills Police Station, pulled a knife out on them and tried to stab him and subsequently shot. One of the I suppose, the missing gaps, and it's more the states, Mr Deputy Speaker, have failed on this, and it could be, again, an Islamic extremist, it could be a white supremacist, and in recent years the concerns have been more about the movement of white supremacists, is have what at the time we were calling community-based orders. Can I say this came from my background when I was formerly a member of Victorian Police Counter-Terrorism Unit, so I have some knowledge of it, and I again thank all my former colleagues and those still working in the area. And the concern of the police is for someone who may be watching beheading videos or hanging out with others who are talking about extremists. And as I was on a delegation a number of years ago when we met with the Swedish counter-terrorism experts, Mr Deputy Speaker, and he pointed out to me in our delegation that if you're simply around all day talking about jihad and terrorist attacks, well, sadly, eventually something may take place. And this community-based protection order could see, for example, the police, in the case of people like Newman Hayter, it could be a family member, it could be a religious leader, it could be a friend, takes the person before magistrate, the magistrate hears the evidence about the concerns, and could put in place an order that the person who they have concerns about potentially can go and undertake a de-radicalisation program. There's such a thing, but most of them haven't been effective, Mr Deputy Speaker. But at least get counselling or have an order that they have to stop watching these beheading videos or in the case of someone like Bambricka, hanging around with someone who's basically of such bad influence that that person of the bad influence is encouraging or inciting others to get involved in the world of terrorism. So I still think there's a great need for that. Sadly, it always takes something really bad to happen before the legislation is put in place. And that brings me to preventative detention orders. Again, I've been, at the start when this was introduced under the Howard government, I was actually critical of this because it didn't go far enough. And the preventative detention order, as it sounds, is to is to stop a terrorist attack. But the concern I had is the person, or it could be a number of people who were picked up by the police. There's not enough evidence to arrest them under Part 1, I think it's Part 1C, the Criminal Code under the Commonwealth, to arrest that person. So they'll pick them up, for example, under preventative detention and hold them in police terms, keep them on ice, trying to make sure they weren't planning a terrorist attack. Well, the concern I had, and I raised this with a number of Attorney Generals from both sides of the political persuasion, with my concerns that the law enforcement needed the ability, if the person was in custody or under preventative detention, to actually ask that person, were they planning anything, or are we worried about a co-offender about to commit a terrorist attack? Now, this legislation at the time didn't allow that. The police, law enforcement could not ask one question on this, and anything which was asked couldn't be used in evidence. And just from my understanding and knowledge, when it comes to police investigations, counter-terrorism investigations are super complex. So the good news when it comes to preventative detention, now law enforcement do have that power. Now, I know it hasn't been used at the Commonwealth level, and I suspect that's because the state police have also put in similar legislation to marry what would be at the Commonwealth level. But we need to do everything we can when it comes to making Australians safe and giving law enforcement the tools to do that. And I had some figures here, Mr Deputy Speaker, when it comes to the amount of those charged. 144 people have been charged in recent years in 71 counter-terrorism related operations, and that was since 2004. So that's pretty amazing work by our law enforcement to go in there and prevent so many terrorist attacks. Sadly, we've seen terrorist attacks overseas when it comes to Bali bombings, and Australians have died, and also London has had so many. And when it comes to the obviously previous Liberal governments, we've been very strong when it comes to supporting the Australian Federal Police. And since 2014, the government has strengthened our national defence against terrorism, investing additional $2.3 billion. And the coalition's always had a very strong record in this space, and providing funding $1.7 billion for the Australian Federal Police, invested over $1.3 billion for Australian security intelligence organisations in the 21-22 budget. And as part of the plan, we released a new counter-terrorism strategy. Additional investment of $86 million was provided in the budget to protect community from threats posed by high-risk terrorist offenders. $66.9 million for continued support for high-risk terrorist offenders regime, and the implementation of extended supervision order framework. And the government also listed 28 terrorist organisations under the criminal code. So I note this will go again for the review when it comes to the Joint Standing Committee, and of the which I think is very important. That committee does great work on the Intelligence and Security Committee. I was a member of that committee a number of years back, and they do great work in going through the legislation. But just as I finish, Mr Deputy Speaker, I paid tribute and pass on our sorrow to all the victims of terrorism, especially the family members. And I always say this, when people think about events when it be Christmas time or birthdays or anniversaries, which most of us look at as being exciting times, sadly when people have lost loved ones in terrorist attacks, they're always wondering why, and it's always when you look at people like those involved in the Bali bombings. It was I'm just trying to think that one of the sheikhs over there who was involved in these attacks. They don't commit the attacks themselves, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's like with the Australian Embassy bombing. I saw the footage for that. The person who planned or person involved in using the truck to go into the gates, they actually had no knowledge of how to drive a car. no knowledge of how to drive a truck, and basically drove past 2 or 3 times before they went in there and committed that attack, and sadly a number of, not Australians but other people lost their lives. So we never can take this for granted. Australia has also done fantastic work when it comes to overseas, providing funding for various counter-terrorism centres around the world in the southeast to support other law enforcement agencies, which has just been so important. So I thank all the other members, and I do think that the government, who's now, can I nearly say, in line with the Liberal and National members when it comes to this legislation. As I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, right from the start, under the Howard government, when these powers were first spoken about, it was very, very controversial, and I remember speaking on the 7:30 report saying it doesn't go far enough because of the preventative detention measures. So this is legislation which is very, very, very important, and I do make the final point for those who kind of think voting Greens at the election. They have never supported any counter-terrorism legislation to make Australians safer, and they always seem to go on the side of the terrorists rather than the side of protecting Australians. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Monash.
I'd like to thank you, First Deputy Speaker, for giving me the call, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his words, having great experience as a former serving police officer himself. The reason there was a lot of controversy when these laws were introduced, Mr Deputy Speaker, was this, that they actually affect our freedoms. I don't know what you're like as a Member of Parliament, but every time I see a piece of legislation like this, I place into it my children and my grandchildren. And I say, what if this legislation was directed at my child or my son, and they were detained without charge for a period of time? That's why these issues are controversial. That's why when we, as a parliament, decide to extend the powers for another 12 months, whether they have been acted on or not, or these powers have been used or not, they are there, and they give an enormous amount of power to the Australian Federal Police to, well, act on our behalf. Act on our behalf. And as long as they are acting on our behalf, we will applaud each move that they make. But all of these powers can be misused and abused. I know no one else will come in and talk about that today, but the reason they were so controversial in the first place was because of exactly that. I'm here as a Member of Parliament to not only serve my constituency and this nation, I'm here as a Member of Parliament to protect my constituency and this nation, even sometimes from our own government. And you say, what a preposterous proposition you're putting, that somebody somewhere would abuse these laws for their own benefit, that there would be no corruption in this country whatsoever, there'll be no person that ever steps out of line. Well, that's not what history tells us down the line, and that's why so many people who are libertarians, if we can call them that, I don't know what you call them these days, not many left. Not many of us left. Not many. That actually look at these issues and take them really seriously. Because if powers like this were misused, your freedom's gone. And I think they have been in Australia in the last 12 months, particularly in Victoria. But that's another whole issue which we won't go down that track. So the government and the former government, there'd be no difference. They are deciding that we should extend these powers for 12 months. So I immediately went to legislation. I looked to see, now, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this so we can give some consideration to other legislation that may be put in place and will get the consideration of the government of the day. It will get consideration of the backbench committee of the government of the day, or the caucus committee of the government of the day, and the caucus committees or the backbench committees of the opposition of the day. It will be debated in the House. There will be consideration and by the party rooms, the caucus and the party rooms of these things, and so there will be further consideration of this issue as we build up to new legislation that may cover it. So I start to feel a bit more comfortable because I know the backbench committees in my party and the caucus committees within the Labor Party are not stupid. And there are men and women in there that have views about these particular issues, and they will voice them. They'll voice, and then it'll go to the Senate. And I believe the Greens or others will ask it to be considered by a Senate committee. So it will be considered again. So I'm just making the point that when we come to make legislation in this House, there's far more consideration given to it than what is in the Herald Sun for just a fleeting moment, because it has been given. And I'm sure, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the independents will want to have something to say about powers that affect the freedoms and obligations of the Australian people. I don't want my children or my grandchildren or any of my family or those that I care for to be pulled up in the street for no reason whatsoever. Now, I think that you can be pulled over in a car for no reason whatsoever, for just a check. That was never the case years ago, never the case. You couldn't just be pulled up for no reason, just for a check. But I think you can now. I think you can now. And so the bill's important, and all the reasons for the listing of why the bill's important and to protect the nation. As the member for Latrobe said, quite rightly, the threat to Australia is still real and probable. And I don't even like the ads on television that talk about the reenactment of the Bali bombings. I don't want to watch a reenactment of a horrific event, which was a major attack on hundreds of Australians who happened to be there at the time, and Germans and French and all the other people that were caught up in that horrible, horrible, horrible situation. I hate terrorism. I hate the fear that drives it, and I hate the disregard for human life that surrounds it to create more fear. But I also fear that incremental changes to our freedoms are grievously important. And if governments of the day and if members of parliament as individuals don't have regard for the freedoms that are crucially important to a nation that has spent blood for such freedoms, and they can't be incrementally taken away, piece by piece, little by little, until the individual no longer has the right that the previous generation enjoyed. That's the only point I'm making here. There is good reason for this legislation to be put in this way, because the Parliament wants more time to consider. And I've just been through before the member for Wright got here as to there are a number of backup provisions and a number of committees that go through any legislation before it gets to the point of being enacted. So we've had a big fight about this a long time ago, about this legislation. We had a big fight about the controversy of it. And it wasn't even in the context of an immediate threat. There have been times in this country where we've faced the terrorism threat, and in fact some damage has been done by individuals, and all of these things that are in this bill do go toward protecting Australians. I don't deny that. And there can always be good arguments put up for bad legislation. I'm not suggesting this is bad legislation. I'm just suggesting to you all that protecting freedoms in this nation should be number 1, number 2 and number 3. Absolutely. Because when I leave this place, and guess what, we all do. One day, even you two younger members of Parliament, the younger members of Parliament on the other side, one day we all leave. And I'm going to make sure when I leave this place, I'm going to leave this nation as free as it was when I came here first in 1990.
Great country.
Right? Because that is really important to me. That's the legacy that we must leave as a nation. When our men and women have gone and shed their blood overseas for us, and you ask them why, and they will say, because we were fighting for the freedom to live the way we want to live in this nation. I'm not going to go into the restrictions that were put in place in Victoria because of COVID, the excuse that was given, and the responses that happened there, and the powers that they then claimed back to enact what they wanted to enact using the Victorian police. So I am very, very attuned at this time to any legislation that may affect the health, well-being and freedom of movement, freedom of association, especially freedom of association and freedom of movement. And I want to be able to walk down the street in the freest nation in the world. I know we're not under threat like other nations like Israel and Palestine and what's happening in the Middle East. We don't live that life. We're not waiting for a missile to come roaring over from nearby in Ainslie or somewhere, from Mount Ainslie, and drop into Parliament. We don't live that life. We're not Israelis, we're not Palestinians, we're not all people under threat around the world. And it gives us a different view. It says, so the Australian view says, should be right, you can bring in legislation like this, there's not a problem, unless it's misused or abused. Now, why would it be misused or abused? I don't know. The options are we don't have legislation like this at all and then the federal police can't act. Well, that's not a go either. That doesn't work for me either. You have to give the powers to the federal police to be able to act on your behalf. But at the same time, I notice each time there is judicial oversight along the track. So if... No, they haven't been used. But once these laws are in place, and it wouldn't surprise me if in 12 months' time the government doesn't come back and say, look, we need another 12 months. And then they've been enacted and in place for a number of years. I think what this should be saying is, if this comes back again, there should be amendments moved to say, no, we'll do a full review. A full review. Absolutely. Now, this legislation says that we're working towards new legislation. I don't want to run out of time here. And that's fine, except the sunset clauses are put in legislation like this because of the seriousness of the legislation. They're not put in there just to say, oh, we'll have a look at that at the end of a certain amount of time. The sunset clauses are put in there to say, yes, we recognise how important this legislation is to the freedom and well-being of this nation. We recognise that. So we're putting in a sunset clause so the government of the day, which is a new government, has to come back and look at the legislation. They have to. Because there's a sunset clause there, and I'm sure the Australian Federal Police are saying, rightly, to the government, look, these laws have been extremely important to us to be able to use if we need them. If we need them. So they're there ready to go. We have been very careful on how we've used them to this point, and they have, clearly, because they haven't used any of them. Yep. But they've been very careful as to how they've used it, because they know how sensitive this is to the Australian people. Well, I suppose a lot of the Australian people just expect us, expect you two, and you, Mr Deputy Speaker, to act on their behalf. They want to believe that you are protecting them in everything you decide in this place, so they don't have to worry about it. And they will say to me, Russell, we elected you to make these decisions. I had some contractors in my house, and I won't tell you what the issue was one day, but they said, if you don't make it compulsory, that'll be fine. And I said to them, and one of them turned to me and he said, look, he said, Russell, we actually elected you to make this decision. So I feel a very heavy responsibility when it comes to bills like this that affect the individual freedom of everybody in this nation. Because I believe Australia needs to be a beacon of freedom. We need to be a place where people know they can come, they can get refuge, and they can live in a free society. This may sound all like rhetoric to some people, but it's real, because it's real legislation. They can really arrest you. They can arrest you without charge. They can accost you without charge. Yes, it's serious, because it's all about our freedoms, and that's why I'm pleading with all parliamentarians, take this legislation very seriously. Make sure that you give anything that comes up that's going to affect your personal freedom or your family's personal freedom or your grandchildren's personal freedom, make sure that you give it your best shot and that you're very comfortable with what the government's doing at any time in legislation that has such a dramatic effect. We've had the blue about it. Now we're agreeing with it and supporting this legislation. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you. It being almost 6:30, I give the call to the member for Macarthur to move that debate be adjourned.
I move that debate be adjourned.
Thank you. And I give the call to the member for Sturt to second the motion.
I second the motion.
Thank you. So I put the question that debate be adjourned until a later day. All those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Against say no. I think the ayes have it. I now give the call to the member for Macarthur to seek leave of the Federation Chamber to move the words I believe you've got in front of you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I move that business intervening before order of the day number 3, government business, be postponed until the next sitting.
Is leave granted?
Leave's granted.
Thank you. The member for Macarthur.
I move that the business intervening before order of the day number 3, government business, be postponed until the next sitting.
Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion.
Thank you. The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. It being 6:30 p.m, the debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 192B, and I give the call to the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 3, grievance debate.
The question is that grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. If there is one issue that unites everyone in my electorate of Mackellar, it is the opposition to the PEP 11 permit for oil and gas exploration, covering 8,200 square kilometres, just 4 kilometres off our stunning beach coastline. A permit that would allow drilling for oil and gas from Newcastle to Palm Beach, Manly to Bondi, some of the world's most stunning and famous beaches. This is a permit that would result in seismic testing of the ocean floor, consisting of intense underwater explosions of up to 230 decibels, firing every 3 to 10 seconds, 24 hours a day, for weeks or months on end. And this along a whale migration pathway, with sound travelling efficiently through water. For some perspective, a Boeing 747 generates only 160 decibels behind the engine. Seismic blasting has devastating effects on marine life. It damages the hearing and the health of dolphins and whales and affects their ability to communicate and migrate. And that's all before oil and gas is even found. It's no wonder that I have not yet met one of my constituents who supports PEP 11. Because, like all Australians, we love where we live. We love our stunning coastline and beaches and pristine waters. We delight in watching the seasonal whale migrations from our shores. We love surfing with the dolphins. We're not prepared to risk it.
Some of you may have travelled to the famous beaches of California where offshore drilling exists. Experience for yourselves the dirty, murky state of the water. Iconic beaches where only last year the oil spill devastated the water and coastline. In California, there are now renewed calls to ban even existing offshore oil and gas. Mr. Deputy Speaker, my community of Mackellar, together with my crossbench colleagues' coastal communities of Warringah and Wentworth, along with our local councils and state MPs, will continue to strenuously oppose PEP 11. Together, our communities successfully fought to have the PEP 11 licence extinguished. So when we were assured in December last year that PEP 11 was dead in the water, our communities celebrated. However, since the recent revelation that the former Prime Minister of Australia was responsible for the decision to end PEP 11 after secretly swearing himself in as a second Resources Minister, the validity of the decision to cancel PEP 11 is being challenged in the federal court. As such, the issue is yet again front and centre in the minds of my community. But it's not just us, it's not just PEP 11, and it's not just a case of NIMBYism. Mr. Deputy Speaker, organisations like the Surfrider Foundation, who have organised coordinated paddle-out protests of surfers across Australia, are a great example of everyday Australians standing up to show there is no social licence for further offshore oil and gas exploration anywhere along Australia's coastline. Nigaloo Reef was spared in 2020 due to community action, and the Great Australian Bight was spared in 2021, again due to community action. The New South Wales State Government has listened to Australians. They have read the room. In February of this year, they announced a new policy whereby offshore exploration and mining for commercial purposes will be prohibited. Why? They declared that the possible impacts of these activities on Indigenous heritage, sensitive marine environments, fishing for commercial and recreational purposes and other recreational activities outweigh the potential benefits. And it goes without saying that the impacts of further fossil fuel mining projects on climate change and on Australia's capacity to meet our Paris Agreement obligations must also be taken into account. With our 2030 target now legislated, there is simply no room for new oil and gas exploration projects. And as the UN Secretary-General recently said, our addiction to fossil fuels is mutually assured destruction. These ocean floor mining projects cause the release of fugitive methane emissions. Methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and with huge leakage rates of up to 66% from these mines. Once drilled, these mining wells can continue to release methane, sometimes in perpetuity. Indeed, this is the situation in the Gulf of Mexico, where unknown quantities of methane and other greenhouse gases continue leaking from tens of thousands of holes in the ocean floor. Starting new fossil fuel mining projects now won't just cause short-term impacts. These projects will continue to produce emissions and environmental impacts for decades. It's why in other jurisdictions offshore drilling has been banned. Take, for example, the US. New exploration has been banned in Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Virginia and California. In California, the ban was imposed in 1994. However, drilling continues. These projects can last for decades. Last month, the government released 47,000 square kilometres of oil and gas acreage for exploration, an area the size of Switzerland. This paves the way for more mega gas projects. As GemWise says, enough already. My electorate, and I hope this chamber, having passed the historic Climate Change Act only a few weeks ago, are serious about trying to reach our 2030 target and our net zero 2050 target. This means not adding to the problem. Australia's large emitters will have a big enough challenge meeting the safeguard mechanism baselines to achieve Australia's 2030 targets. There is no room for more. It comes down to this. Releasing acreage for oil and gas exploration isn't in the interest of climate change, it isn't in the interest of our environment, it isn't in the interest of clean beaches, and it isn't in the interest of my community. It isn't in the interest of the existing high emitters who will have to cut emissions further if new projects are brought online. And it isn't in the interest of our Pacific neighbours who will bear the impacts of rising sea levels. In fact, only last week the UN Human Rights Committee made a historic legal finding that due to Australia's inaction on climate change, we have violated our human rights obligations of the 8 Torres Strait Islander peoples who brought the action. Enough of the devastation to our environment and enough of the devastation to our climate. Enough of the devastation to human rights violations. Let's focus on clean, renewable offshore opportunities now possible due to the passage of the former government's offshore electricity infrastructure project. We have 6. Let's grow that number. We need more of Mike Cannon-Brookes Sun Cable, which will provide power to Singapore, of Matt Keane's Waratah batteries, which offer a vital backstop for our renewable energy, and Hunter Industrial Precincts, which will forge the green steel and aluminium that will transform Asia and hopefully Australia. It's time to pivot to the future and not stick in the past. I call on the government to follow the New South Wales State Government's example and close the book on any future release of ocean floor exploration licences for oil and gas.
The question is that grievances be noted, and I'll give the call to the member for Lalor.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And my first grievance, Acting Deputy Speaker, is that the seat that I represent is called Lawler, after the great Peter Lawler. And I'll never tire of reminding people in this House that that's how it's pronounced. And I would remind all members present that anyone who gets that wrong has to answer to Barry Jones, who I made a commitment to ensure that people would say it as Peter said his own name, and that's with an Irish accent and therefore Lawler. From the stands of the MCG to the sands of Chirnside Park is how the Werribee Football Club's theme song begins. It was written by a local many, many years ago and has stood the test of time as still being the theme song for the Werribee Football Club, which of course plays in the VFL competition, a proud standalone community club. And having just come through the Festival of the Boot, as the member for Lilly, the Minister for Sport, calls the last 6 weeks, I want to pay tribute to lots of our local football clubs. But I'd say it's more a festival of the ball. And so I want to pay tribute to our football, netball and basketball locally, as well as our hockey and some of our other, what people call minor sports. But it has been a festival, and the Werribee Football Club in the VFL are very proud that Tom Gribble has won the JJ Liston Trophy for the VFL this year. A terrific achievement from Tom Gribble. And Scott Bishop, another local, a long-time Werribee timekeeper, has been awarded the VFL Volunteer of the Year. The Festival of the Ball has seen me attend many games of football across the last few months. I was absolutely thrilled to attend some of the WRFL Grand Finals and Final Series held at the Avalon Oval, which is Chirnside Park, home of the Werribee VFL Club, but also host to many of the WRFL finals. There are 34 clubs across the WRFL, the Western Region Football League, across the juniors and seniors. 8 of those clubs are in the seat of Lawler, across various divisions in juniors and seniors, and there was much to celebrate. One club, Werribee Districts, managed to have 3 teams in grand final day, under 18s, reserves and seniors. The 3 for 3 that people started the day hoping for was not achieved, but the Werribee District's under 18s defeated Point Cook to be premiers, the reserves defeated Altona to be premiers, and the seniors were runners-up to Altona's and bravely came from 4th, so faced an elimination final every week. We saw some terrific football on display, and I want to congratulate all of the teams from across the electorate of Lalor, which included Hoppers Crossing in that series of the senior finals. And again, in the TIV Division 1 Seniors Best and Fairest, the Barry Priest Medal was awarded to Werribee District's player Dylan Viojo Rainbow. Werribee Districts took out the TIV Division 1 Reserves Best and Fairest to Chris Scudamore, and in the under-18 division, Brock Spiteri won the Best and Fairest in Division 1. An extraordinary achievement for one of my local clubs, a great final series and a great season. Moving down the road, the Wyndham Vale Football Club managed the Division 2 Reserves Premiers, where they defeated Parkside at Yarraville Oval, and the Senior Women's Division 2 Best and Fairest was from the Wyndham Vale Football Club, and I'd like to congratulate Mariah Burton. And I'd also like to say that it's terrific to see so many women taking the field to play football in my local community. And I'd recommend anyone in the chamber that wants to see an inspirational video to go onto YouTube, look up the Wyndham Vale Falcons inspirational video narrated by one of their female players. It is an inspirational video about the power of sport, about the positive things that sport brings to us. Another club from my local area that had a terrific season were the Suns. They managed to get the seniors and reserves in the Division 3 of the WRFL to the grand final, and the Division 3 Senior Coach of the Year, Dean Caccia, was their senior coach and named Senior Coach of the Year. Another terrific season for the Suns. They've had lots to celebrate, and I know they're still celebrating now. The Manor Lakes Football Club had the captain of the WRL Division 1 Women's Team of the Year, Jamie Payton, a local player, was named captain of that team. Another sensational outcome. Another football club that I represent here is the Werribee Centrals Football and Netball Club. Their juniors play in the WFL, their seniors play in the Geelong District Football Netball League. And I note that the GDFL have changed their name to include netball in their title, which of course I welcome. And I'd note that my time at Centrals across the last few years, I have been absolutely inspired by what has happened at that club. First, bringing netball into the club and what that meant for participation for girls, followed by bringing in the women's football as well. The netballers there have had a terrific season. The under-19s were the championship win against Belmont. They had the Megan Dean medal in the 17s and under. Charlie Hocking won that medal. The leading goal scorer was Remy Brunato for the 17s and unders. And the Team of the Year and A-grade were third placed. Amanda O'Malley was named in that. So a terrific season for them. In football, the under-18 Division 2 Best and Fairest went to the Ray Ettridge medal went to Max Murdoch, and the Youth Coach of the Year was Justin Johns. The GDFL Team of the Year, Tyler Crenham, was named in that. Wasn't just about football though, this festival. It was also about basketball, and I want to congratulate the Wyndham Basketball Association to be the first club to win both senior champion divisions, men and women. An extraordinary achievement and a great way to celebrate the end of their season. They are the second largest basketball association in Victoria, doing fabulous work, making sure we've got young people really active and involved, and also that Diane Ananiev was named Youth Player of the Year in the 2022 Big V Awards. So a terrific outcome for them as well. And on the 10th of September, I was thrilled to once again attend Rugby Victoria's Junior Grand Final Day, which is held in my electorate at the Mossfield Sports Centre, and local teams, the local club there, the Wyndham Rhinos, had the 13s, 14s and 16s playing on Grand Final Day. The 13s defeated the Melton to become premiers, the 14s defeated Endeavour Hills to become premiers, and the 16s went down to the Bulldogs. But I'd like to thank Ian Drummond, the president, for his tireless work over so many years and his welcome every year. I'd also like to thank Rugby Victoria for the work that they do. It is a bit of a code switch for me, but I can tell you that I absolutely love watching rugby union. There's nothing quite as exciting, particularly in the juniors, as watching somebody get a high knee, and a bit of a dance, and off they go. It is fantastic to watch those kids step it out. And I note too, watching boys and girls play together in that grand final that I saw that day was absolutely inspiring, and the way the families and the community get around it is extraordinary. I also had recently the joy of attending a final where the Werribee Hockey men's team took out that final when I was there that day, and to thank them for their work. Despite this festival, to take me to my grievance, despite all of the local sport that happens, our sport participation rates in my community are low. So if you heard that list, there seems to be sport everywhere. But it's challenging in our community. It's challenging because we have so many young families. We have so many young people, but we also have very hard-working families, people working and travelling long distances to and from work, which makes it really difficult to get kids involved in sport. So as a community, we have to think of creative ways to get our young people involved in the passion of sport, the power of sport, the joy of sport, not just for the fitness and health benefits, but for the way it builds character, builds team. And I want to pay tribute tonight to all of the people who've worked for many, many years to get kids into sport. Everything you do, every day, I am grateful for, and thrilled that as a member for Lalor I get to come and see it. But I want to assert one more time that I'm there to help all of our local sporting clubs to find those creative ways to ensure that we build youth participation in sport. Because what I see in the community is that there's a lot of kids playing sport, or rather, there's a lot of sport being played by kids, but sometimes it's the same kid playing 5 sports rather than 5 kids playing 1 sport. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
And I thank the member for Lalor for her contribution. The question is that grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Riverina.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. In the past 24 hours, NASA scientists have been celebrating a successful crashing of a spaceship into an asteroid millions of kilometres from Earth. It's been an historic test of humanity's ability to prevent a cosmic object one day devastating life on this planet. So what we've seen is a 590-kilogram spaceship, around the size of a refrigerator, striking the moonlit asteroid Dimorphos, travelling at around 24,000 kilometres an hour, and this happened about 11 million kilometres away from Earth. Fantastic. Cost $324.5 million. And yet, closer to home, you've got millions of kids starving. I know these things are important. I understand that we need to, as a society, NASA needs to, as a scientific organisation, the United States needs to, as a world-leading country, to do these things to prevent perhaps what happened at the end of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, when a large rock struck the Earth, ending the Cretaceous Paleogene era, wiping out all those large animals which dominated the Earth for tens of millions of years. But, you know, I know I'm getting old, I might be getting cranky, I'm probably both. But, you know, when you see a country like the US, and I know that it's important to defend yourself. I understand that. You understand that, Deputy Speaker Wilkie. The price of peace is eternal vigilance. But $801 billion US spent on arms in 2021. That's by America. Worldwide, $2.1 trillion. And you've got kids in Africa starving. You've got mothers holding babes in arms, dying before their very eyes. And this isn't just happening as isolated incidents. This is happening in thousands upon thousands of communities. Now, Australia is providing $15 million in emergency assistance in response to the hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa and Yemen. Now, this is a tenth of what the not-for-profit organisation said was needed. I do thank the government for providing this assistance. Last week I called on the government to provide $150 million, which is what the not-for-profits say is required as a base measure. Now, making the announcement, the Minister for International Development said that the Australian Council for International Development, ACFID, welcomed the announcement. He made that point, and he talked about the global efforts to combat looming famine in affected parts of the world. And Minister Conroy is right, and I've always said that Australia should look after its backyard, the Indo-Pacific region. Europe should look after Africa, and North America, Canada, US should look after Latin and Central and South America, and the poor people in those areas affected should be looked after by the global's leading citizens and richer countries. ACFID Chief Executive Mark Purcell said that the Albanese government's response to the hunger crisis is a great start on Labor's stated commitment to being a responsible international citizen. He's right, I acknowledge that. But it's a small start. Much more is going to need to be done. And we need to step up and do it. Right now, 10,000 children are dying each day from hunger. That's an entire classroom of children dying in Australia every 3.5 minutes. The pandemic, COVID-19, ongoing droughts and the war in Ukraine have created a perfect storm for a global food crisis. Now, since the beginning of the pandemic, hunger has increased by roughly 150 million people across the globe. Just think about that. 150 million. Our population's around 25 million. 6 times our population. Jobs have been lost or made insecure, household budgets have tightened and supply chains have been disrupted, resulting in increased prices. And I understand that Australian families are doing it hard. I get that. But the Horn of Africa is experiencing its worst drought in 40 years, 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons. And across the world, extreme weather events have damaged crops and livelihoods, drastically reducing people's ability to feed themselves. And on top of that, we've got the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. It's an act of military bastardry. It's not only causing a devastating impact on Ukrainians, but the world's most vulnerable by exacerbating the global food crisis, by upsetting global food supply chains. The Russia-Ukraine war is being fought in the breadbasket of Europe. When I wrote that op-ed last week in the Daily Telegraph, I sent it to my National Party colleagues. I was amazed by the response I got. People reached out to me, and I've always known that I belong to a compassionate party, and that certainly brought that home to me. Sometimes I think in politics, our side of politics perhaps isn't always considered as compassionate as the other side of politics, if I could just put it that way. But they are genuine. We need to do more genuinely, and we should, and we must, and hopefully we will. As reported by Reuters last week, the European Union is divided on how to help poorer countries fight a growing food crisis and address shortages of fertilisers caused by the war in Ukraine, with some fearing a plan to invest in plants in Africa would clash with, wait for it, EU green goals. I mean, really? You've got kids starving in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, and you've got rich countries worrying about green goals? I mean, my God, where have we become as a society, as humanity? At a summit of EU leaders later in the week, the EU is planning a new initiative which would structurally decrease poorer nations' reliance on Russian fertilisers by helping them develop their own fertiliser plants. Okay, but at a meeting with EU envoys in that week, in that particular June week, the EU Commission explicitly opposed the narrative. Listen to this. warning that supporting fertiliser production in developing nations would be inconsistent with EU energy and environmental policies. That's what officials said. Just beggars belief. It just beggars belief. What bloody mindedness. Are we really going to stand by and let people die for the sake of a woke agenda? And I do appreciate that fertiliser has an impact on the environment, yes. It requires energy, yes. But let me tell you, coming from a multi-generational farming family, it's also hugely effective in boosting agricultural output. If you don't use fertiliser, you don't get the output that you require, that you need. I appreciate that the National Farmers Federation here in Australia, and through its chair, Fiona Simpson, has said that they could potentially do some things with food aid. That's to be encouraged. But right now, with double the population of Australia on the brink of famine, more, absolutely more, we cannot give up on finding a solution offering our support, no matter what that may be. If it's money, well, so be it. In a few weeks, a famine will be declared in Somalia. Soon to follow will be Afghanistan, and haven't we lost some lives there to make that country a better place? Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan and Yemen. Now, the threshold for a famine to be declared is extreme. Lots of people think that Africa's in famine all the time. It's not. Famine has only been declared twice this century, Somalia 2011 and South Sudan in 2017. But this is a crisis point. This is an absolute crisis point. And the last time a famine was declared in Somalia, of the more than 250,000 people who lost their lives, 129,000 were children under the age of 5. Half of the total death toll perished before a famine was declared. So I call on the government to do what it can. I call on people of a good heart to do what they can. We must do more. We have to do more to save people's lives.
The question is that the grievance be noted, and I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I saw the consequences of government corruption early in life. I remember travelling overseas with my parents on holiday. We arrived at the Border Immigration Office and presented our passports. The advertised sign for a visa entry was $50 US, but my mum ended up handing over $55 US. I asked her what the extra $5 was for, and she told me it was for the immigration officer to pocket. And that was my first introduction to government corruption. In every interaction, there was potential for corruption, bribery and fraud. And people living in that country knew in order to get things done with the government, money had to be exchanged. And I distinctly remember seeing a sealed tar road leading up to a huge estate. And the road stood out to me because all the roads in that town had been bumpy dirt tracks. So I asked our family friend if the estate was some sort of government building or a place of national significance. And she simply replied that the owners of the estate were wealthy and had paid off the local government officials with bribes to build the public road leading up to their house. And this is what happens when corruption permeates and becomes the norm in a country. It undermines trust in government, increases inequality, and it means growth and progress stagnates. And critically, it undermines democracy. Democracy only flourishes when decisions are made openly and transparently. Governments need to be held accountable. Their decisions need to be scrutinised and they need to be made in the public interest. Corruption in Australia might not have been quite as obvious, but we have never been immune to it. Over the last decade, according to Transparency International, we have come down the rankings of the Corruption Perceptions Index. On a scale out of 100, Australia's score in 2012 was 85. In 2021, that had dropped to 73, a 12-point drop. Alongside Hungary, Australia experienced the biggest drop of all OECD countries. Not only does this drop in perception have a consequence for our democracy, it also has an economic consequence too. because corruption has a corrosive economic impact. It builds distrust between corporations and governments. It has an impact on long-term investment decisions. In every state and territory in Australia, there's an anti-corruption body. In my home state of New South Wales, the Independent Commission Against Corruption has exposed the presence of corrupt activities in the state. Corrupt activity that meant interests of individuals were placed over the public's and community's interests. These activities have been committed by representatives at both levels of government, local and state, by both major political parties, including the party that I am a part of, the Labor Party. It saddens me to say that, but I am grateful to the Sydney Morning Herald's investigative reporter, Kate McClymont, for exposing this corrupt behaviour, and I'm grateful to the Independent Commission Against Corruption for its thorough investigation. I'm grateful because I don't want to be part of a party with corrupt representatives. I want their behaviour exposed, investigated and prosecuted. Currently, the only jurisdiction that does not have an anti-corruption body is at the federal level. Just extraordinary, isn't it? Given the magnitude of the decisions made in this place. In response to the former government's contention that there was no corruption at a federal level, Geoffrey Watson SC, a former counsel assisting the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, said, "This argument is not only absurd, it's circular. Without a federal agency armed with the appropriate investigative tools, it is unlikely that corruption will be detected, much less exposed." Integrity in Parliament was an issue raised with me during the election campaign. Time after time, door knocked after door knocked, the people of Reid raised their concerns about the lack of integrity in our Parliament. And that's why I'm so proud to be part of a Labor government that is establishing a powerful, transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission, and that is happening this week. The Commission will be tasked with investigating serious and systemic corrupt conduct across the entire federal public sector and will have the following design principles. It will have broad jurisdiction to investigate corrupt conduct across the Commonwealth by ministers, parliamentarians and their staff, and across the public service. It will be independent of government with discretion to commence inquiries on its own initiative. It will be overseen by a statutory parliamentary joint committee. It will have retrospective powers. It will have the power to hold public hearings. It will have the power to refer matters to the AFP or the Commonwealth Department of Public Prosecutions. It will have procedural fairness and be subject to judicial review. Importantly too, the legislation that will seek to enshrine the National Anti-Corruption Commission will provide strong protections for whistleblowers and exemptions for journalists to protect the identity of their sources. Both of these elements are fundamental to the orderly administration of a democracy like ours. A great feature of the debate around integrity and the Anti-Corruption Commission so far has been the degree of collaboration and consultation across the Parliament. While it's early days in terms of its passage through Parliament, I'm glad to see that the Independents, the Greens and more recently the Opposition have been constructively working on this important policy. It sends a signal that integrity, accountability and transparency are important in this Parliament. The National Anti-Corruption Commission will be a policy that we look back on in years to come and ask ourselves how we ever managed without it. It's a body that will help to build trust in our government, trust in our politics and trust in our democracy. And while that may sound abstract, it's a policy that's fundamentally about ensuring better government and better policy outcomes for citizens across this country, including my own constituents of Reid, who I am so proud to serve. It's about ensuring that people have faith that government is serving those whom it is supposed to serve, not those who might seek to unduly influence it. It's about ensuring integrity in government, not just for integrity's sake, but because it will materially improve people's lives. So while it's tempting to think of the National Anti-Corruption Commission in big, bold, but somewhat abstract terms, its real impact will be felt in better policy for people's day-to-day lives. A National Anti-Corruption Commission is long overdue, so let's get this done.
I thank the member for their contribution. The question is that the grievance be noted, and I call the member for Wright.
I thank the Madam Speaker for the opportunity to follow the honourable member for Reid and welcome her contribution, salient contribution to the House. The opposition stands steadfast in stamping out any corruption that exists in this place and are at lockstep with that end goal. It was comforting to hear in your speech that you dedicated so eloquently the failings of both parties, including the one that you so proudly represent here. And being a member of considerable more years in this place, we have seen members from state jurisdictions or political parties prosecuted and sentenced to lengthy periods of time. So I can understand from the state that you come from that they'd be much more exposed to criminal activities that have transpired. Our federal parliament in the Senate particularly also has had members of parties retire disgracefully, and that behaviour, whatever colour jersey you wear here, must be stamped out. I just wanted to follow on, and I know there'll be a place and a time as the ICAC legislation is introduced into the House, and share with the House and the member for Reid concerns, particularly in my electorate. I have a council, Logan City, it's well known, it's a local council. Allegations of corruption, fraud were laid. The council was disbanded, an administrator was appointed. The blanket charge on all the councillors was fraud, and the fraud had to do with the appointment of a CEO, and I won't detain the House with the granular detail of it, but nevertheless, there were innocent people, and one of the tenets that I will stand in this place and defend is the premise of innocent until proven guilty. If we abandon those principles in this place, then we should be labelled corrupt. Innocent until proven guilty must always be our fundamental foundation of how we move forward in this place. Now, there were councillors. Charges were laid against them. Fraud. Their reputations trashed. Their children bullied at school. They were driven from their community. They lost their livelihoods. They were gone. Their reputations impugned. Medical attention was sought. They were on antidepressants to get through these traumatic times. They were unable to run for local government elections because the state ICAC equivalent body sat over them while charges were still being investigated. Without detaining the House, the long story short is, after the election, when these councillors had left, embarrassingly, their reputations, they were virtually unemployable, when they applied for positions with the state bureaucracy, and these people weren't friends of my party, but I will defend their right because they were unjustly dealt with through an ICAC equivalent in Queensland that lost the provisions of innocent until proven guilty. They end up leaving the district. They applied for public service positions, and on the application they had to write, have you ever been charged with a criminal offence? Yes, fraud. What do you think the chances are of these people getting picked up by the public service? 0. Months later, the ICAC equivalent comes out and says, nothing to see here. But the damage is already done. Now, if it was a civil case, there'd be opportunities for damages to be awarded against those person or personnel or a class action. But because of the nature of the body and its reference, that level of remedy is no longer available to them. So whilst, and I appreciate the member for Reed's leaving the chamber at the moment, this issue will not leave the chamber, and I would ask all members on the other side as they introduce bills into the House to make sure that as we step forward to stamp out corruption, that we should be in lockstep. We should be in absolute lockstep to stand out every inch of corruption, and in doing so we need to understand what the definitions of corruption are. Because as elected officials, our job is to secure as much funding for our region as possible. And if doing so, we derive a benefit for it, that we are elected at the next election. By definition, are we all corrupt? And the answer is clearly not. Because we don't have a real definition for what corruption is. At the periphery, we know what it is. Personal financial gain. But when the lawyers get hold of this, I can assure you, unless there is definitive understanding, and journalists and the Fourth Estate are now debating what that definition of corruption looks like. Because I can share with the Parliament my enthusiasm to represent my people to the best of my ability to ensure that I secure as much funding for my region as I can is what I get out of bed every day for. That's what I'm elected to do. The member for Monash before me, coming to the chamber, he spoke about his people elected him to make the decisions on their behalf. My people elected me to make the decisions on their behalf, to fight on their behalf, to be their voice. And I'll continue to do that. I haven't seen the ICAC bill come. I haven't seen the granular detail of the bill come before the House. But I will welcome the Senate inquiry that follows, and I hope that it's wide and broad and goes around the country, and I hope it takes evidence from the very characters that I spoke of earlier in my speech. And I hope it hears evidence from them of how their lives were destroyed. It has to do its job. It has to catch, ICAC has to catch those corrupt beings. But it cannot crucify innocent public officials. It cannot take in its wake collateral damage. And if it does so, there must be remedial damages allowed to prevent frivolous cases. Too many times at local government, I see litigious actions, frivolous litigious actions taken against councillors just out of spite. It clogs their systems up in Queensland. Now, the Attorney-General I know to be an honourable man. He and I have had discussions on this. And we will have more discussions as the debate ensues. But I would just remind members, this is an issue. It has similarities to the Building and Construction Commission provisions that were abolished by the government when coming to office. And the debate that was argued by government officials at that particular time was, the law is there to protect, and the law is there for everyone, and if there's a problem on building sites, refer them to the police. Why is it one rule for one side of politics and not the other? Why is it that we would not share those same learnings when it comes to this debate? Now, Mr. Speaker, you might find this amusing, Madam Speaker, that I had no intentions of speaking on the ICAC debate tonight in my grievance. I actually had a speech here fully prepared about Labor keeping your hands off regional funding in my area. But when I hear a debate come in from those on the other side on an issue, and I understand members get given their speaking points, they come into the chamber loyal to their party, with little or may not the full regard for the collateral damage, the wake of destruction that can pursue if we do not handle this very carefully. And I hope tonight I've just shared a few points to put in the back of people's subconscious that as we move forward on this debate, that we do always hold true to the tenements of innocent until proven guilty. I thank the House.
The question is that the grievance be noted, and I call the member for Bean.
Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak about both the grievance and hope. A betrayal of many of the most vulnerable in our community through the robo-debt scandal and the erosion of trust in government over the last 9 years. But with hope in the commencement of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission today and the imminent introduction of Anti-Corruption Commission legislation tomorrow, despite some of the fears others in this chamber might have. The robo-debt debacle had a devastating impact across Australia. It had a devastating impact in Canberra, and I know that it had a detrimental impact on local families in my electorate of Bean. Over 400,000 people had unlawful debts raised against them by the previous government, marking a shameful chapter in the administration of our social security system and a massive failure of public administration. My electorate of Bean was no exception, with the scheme creating catastrophic stress and anxiety for many of my constituents. In one instance, a 28-year-old constituent with an intellectual disability was being chased for a debt all the way back to 2015 without any prior notice or review of her earnings by Centrelink. Our most vulnerable and often most ill-equipped to properly understand or challenge the basis of such debts were targeted. The previous government persistently denied that its pet scheme was illegal or that it was doing harm, dismissing it as a robo-scam. They argued that the harassment letters were all about integrity. It was just a simple request for information. After months of dragging victims of robo-debt through further stress and anxiety and hardship, the scheme was found to be illegal, with the government finally agreeing to zeroing the debts. My heart goes out to the families across the country who were devastated and damaged by this unfair process, and in some cases lost loved ones. According to data from the Department of Human Services covering the period from 2016 to 18, more than 2,030 people died after receiving a Centrelink debt notice, and of those, about 1/5 were aged under 35. Most people who died were still receiving Centrelink payments at the time of their deaths. While the cause of death was undetermined by the department, about 1/3 of the people were classified as vulnerable. In other words, they had complex needs like mental illness, drug use, or were victims of domestic violence. In November 2019, a class action was commenced by the representative applicants and the Commonwealth agreed to a settlement. The settlement was approved at a sum of $112 million. Deputy Speaker, what a huge waste of public money towards something that should never have happened. Thankfully, most debts raised using average income information have already been refunded, and anyone who made repayments to a debt raised using averaging ATO income under the program between 2015 and 2019 are eligible for a refund. Regarding the outcome, Justice Murphy of the Federal Court explained, the proceeding has exposed a shameful chapter in the administration of the Commonwealth social security system and a massive failure of public administration. And further, it should have been obvious to the senior public servants and to the responsible ministers at different points who designed and were charged with overseeing the robo-debt system that many social security recipients do not earn a stable or constant income, and any employment that they obtain may be casual, part-time, sessional or intermittent and may not continue throughout the year. The success of the class action was a significant milestone. However, we need to ensure such a debacle never happens again. We need to understand how ministers and senior public servants overlook something so significant as the unreliable income averaging based on ATO data. We do not know if public servants were inappropriately heavied and politicised. Additionally, the ongoing failure to acknowledge the mounting evidence of serious problems following its implementation. We need to clarify how much the implementation, suspension and windback of the robo-debt scheme costs taxpayers, investigate the devastating harm caused to law-abiding Australians, and investigate the use of third-party debt collectors under the scheme. Beyond the harm that robo-debt has caused to so many vulnerable Australians, we also need to consider its impact on democratic governance, government integrity and broader trust in our public institutions. Robo-debt not only demonstrated a complete failure on public engagement, but also a complete disregard for its citizens. Citizens felt disempowered and under attack. This can lead to increased fear of corruption. If we do not restore public trust in our institutions, we risk losing their cooperation with the public system. Our social contract is compromised and undermined. Alarming statistics have already been revealed by Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Drawing on expert assessments, the data used analyses the perceptions of public sector corruption. Australia has plummeted 7 places since 2012, from 11th out of 180 countries to 18th. Additionally, a Vote Compass survey found 85% of Australians believe corruption is a problem in this country. This has a destructive impact that extends to wasted taxpayer funds, loss of goods and services, let alone eroding the trust we have in the public sector to act in our best interests. That's why it's critical that we restore integrity and confidence in our system through supporting the Royal Commission. In contrast to the previous government that refused to take responsibility, this is what we promised to Australians prior to the election. I welcome the Royal Commission commencing this morning in Brisbane, led by the Honourable Catherine Holmes, a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Queensland, who brings vast experience from a distinguished legal career. The Royal Commission's focus will be on decisions made by those in positions of seniority. As requested, the Department of Social Services, the Attorney-General's Department, Services Australia and other relevant agencies will provide information. Anyone with relevant information will also be able to engage in the process. And like many Australians, I look forward to the final report to be delivered by the Governor-General by April 2023. And Deputy Speaker, despite the fears expressed by the previous speaker, I look forward to restoring integrity and competence in our system of government with the establishment of a National Anti-Corruption Commission. This is a key commitment by Labor in the election campaign, and it was a key commitment from our local Labor team in the ACT community too. And that's why I welcome the announcement that the Albanese government will introduce legislation tomorrow to establish a powerful, transparent and independent National Anti-Corruption Commission. It's a critical step that demonstrates that the government is delivering on its promise to tackle corruption and restore trust and integrity to federal politics. The Albanese government's National Anti-Corruption Commission will investigate serious or systemic corrupt conduct across the entire federal public sector. And as outlined by the Attorney-General today, it will be built on the following design principles: a broad jurisdiction to investigate serious or systemic corrupt conduct across the Commonwealth public sector by ministers, parliamentarians and their staff, statutory office holders, employees of all government entities and government contractors. It will be independent. The Commission will operate independent of government with discretion to commence inquiries into serious or systemic corruption on its own initiative or in response to referrals, including from whistleblowers and the public. And there will be oversight. The Commission will be overseen by a statutory parliamentary joint committee empowered to require the Commission to provide information about its work. It will have retrospective powers. The Commission will have the power to investigate allegations of serious or systemic corruption that occurred before or after its establishment. And the Commission will have the power to hold public hearings in exceptional circumstances and when it's in the public interest to do so. And the Commission will be empowered to make findings of fact, including findings of corrupt conduct, and refer findings that could constitute criminal conduct to the Australian Federal Police or the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions. And it will operate with procedural fairness, with its findings subject to judicial review. Importantly, the legislation will also provide strong protections for whistleblowers and exemptions for journalists to protect the identity of sources. And following the introduction of the bill, the government will propose the establishment of a joint select committee to examine its provisions. There'll be well enough time for the parliament to properly ensure that this is a bill that does what it says it's going to do. We look forward to support from across the parliament for the establishment of National Anti-Corruption Commission with real power and authority, and we look forward to the outcomes of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. It's essential to bring this parliament back into the light.
There being no further grievances, the debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. All of those opinions say aye. Aye. I think the ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow.